What if the greatest lost civilization before history was not a city buried under sand, not a vanished empire, and not a secret world more advanced than our own, but something quieter? A way of living, remembering, building and gathering that left almost no written trace because writing had not yet arrived. The cold truth is that most of the human past did not record itself for us. It passed through voices, hands, fires, coastlines and places now buried under earth or drowned beneath rising seas. So when we ask whether a lost civilization existed before history, are we really asking about a missing kingdom? Or about how much of human intelligence disappeared before anyone could write it down? When we ask whether a lost human civilization existed before history, the first thing we have to slow down and notice is the word civilization itself. It is a word that feels solid, as if everyone agrees on what it means. But the moment we place it far back in time, before writing, before kings, before named cities, it begins to loosen in our hands. We usually imagine civilization as something made of stone walls, streets, temples, laws, records, rulers, and maps. We imagine a place with a name, a center, a boundary, and a story that can be read from beginning to end. That image is not wrong for many later societies, but it may become misleading when we carry it too far backward into the long human world before written history. For most of our existence, human beings did not leave tablets, royal lists, tax records, or carved monuments explaining who they were. They left broken tools, buried hearths, bones, pigments, shelters, pathways, and sometimes great structures whose meanings are still partly hidden from us. So the question is not simply whether there was a lost city somewhere before history began. The deeper question is whether our usual idea of civilization is too narrow to recognize older forms of human order. A group of people could know the seasons with great precision and still leave no calendar. They could remember safe routes across mountains and plains and still leave no map. They could gather at certain places, return to them over generations, teach children where to find water, how to prepare food, how to read animal movement, how to treat the dead, and how to carry stories through the dark of winter. And yet none of this would look like civilization if we only searched for palaces and written archives. This does not mean we should invent a hidden empire where evidence is absent. It means we should be careful with the frame we are using. Before history, human life was not empty simply because it was not written down. The absence of writing does not mean the absence of memory. The absence of cities does not mean the absence of rules. The absence of kings does not mean the absence of leadership, obligation, skill, or shared belief. A small band moving with the seasons might seem simple from a distance, but inside that life there could be knowledge so detailed that a modern stranger would be helpless without it. Every plant, every track, every change in wind, every pattern of ice or rain could matter. Every elder might carry a kind of living archive, not stored on clay or paper, but held in voice, gesture, habit, and repeated practice. This is where the idea of a lost civilization becomes quieter, and perhaps more interesting. Maybe what was lost was not one shining city waiting under the sand. Maybe what was lost was a different way of being organized, one that did not need writing to be meaningful, and did not need monuments to be intelligent. If we begin with the wrong definition, we may look at the deep past and see only absence. But if we begin more patiently, we may see a human world that was not primitive in the way people often imagine, only less visible to the kinds of evidence that survive. And that is why the first step in this question is not to search for a vanished kingdom. It is to ask what we are willing to recognize as human complexity before history learned how to write its own name. The word civilization also carries another quiet problem. It makes us look for height, size, and permanence. We tend to trust what rises above the ground more than what moved through forests, along rivers, across grasslands, or beside changing coasts. A stone wall feels more convincing than a remembered path. A carved inscription feels more official than a story told correctly for 100 generations. A buried temple feels more serious than a circle of people returning to the same hill every season, watching the same stars, teaching the same songs, and marking the same changes in the land. This is not because stone is always more meaningful than memory. It is because stone is more likely to survive us. When later civilizations appear in the archaeological record, they often announce themselves with things that endure: walls, tombs, roads, storage rooms, seals, tablets, monuments, and sometimes the names of kings. Before written history, however, much of human intelligence was carried in materials that were not meant to last forever. Wood, hide, fibre, bone, song, gesture, and spoken instruction could shape an entire life and then disappear almost completely. So when we ask whether a lost human civilization existed before history, we may be asking a question that favours the kinds of societies that left behind hard evidence and quietly ignores those whose greatest achievements were portable, seasonal, oral, and social. A community might not have built a city, yet it could have understood how to survive in a landscape that changed month by month. It might not have had a palace, yet it could have had rules about marriage, sharing, grief, hunting, territory, healing, and obligation. It might not have had writing, yet it could have had memory systems strong enough to keep practical knowledge alive across generations. If we define civilization only as settled urban life with writing and government, then most of the human past will stand outside the door. But if we define it too loosely, then the word loses meaning and becomes only a complement for human cleverness. The careful path lies between these two mistakes. We should not pretend that every prehistoric group was a civilization in the same sense as Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, or early China. That would blur important differences and create a false picture. But we should also not imagine early humans as scattered, empty, and simple just because they did not leave a written explanation of themselves. The real question is more delicate. Before history, were there societies that reached levels of coordination, shared belief, long-distance connection, and inherited knowledge that were more complex than older textbooks once suggested? That question can be explored honestly. It does not require a lost superpower. It does not require secret machines, vanished alphabets, or impossible claims. It only requires us to admit that the deep past is unevenly preserved. What survives may be only the hardest shell of a much larger life. The soft parts, where meaning often lived, are mostly gone, and because of that, the word civilization becomes less like a clear label and more like a test of our patience. Are we looking for proof of an ancient empire, or are we learning how to recognize human complexity when it does not look like the later world we already understand? There is also a reason this question feels so powerful to us. A lost civilization before history sounds like a doorway into a hidden room, as if the human past might contain a secret chapter that was almost erased. But the careful version of that idea is not about proving that a forgotten empire once ruled the world. It is about noticing how much of human life can vanish when it is not protected by writing, stone, or continuous memory. History, in the strict sense, begins when people leave records that can speak across time in a more direct way. Before that, we enter prehistory, not because nothing happened, but because what happened must be understood through traces rather than voices. This difference matters. A written record can tell us names, dates, claims, victories, debts, boundaries, prayers, and laws. A prehistoric trace can tell us something else, that a fire burned here, that people returned here, that a tool was shaped by practiced hands, that pigment touched a wall, that bodies were buried with care, that stones were lifted and arranged, that animals were followed, that food was gathered, that children learned by watching. These are not empty signs. They are quiet signs. They do not give us a complete story, but they remind us that a story existed. So when we use the phrase, before history, we should be careful not to hear it as before intelligence, or before culture, or before meaning. Human beings had already been human for a very long time before anyone wrote a sentence that survived. They had already learned to speak, cooperate, remember, mourn, teach, adapt, and imagine. They had already crossed difficult landscapes, endured climate changes, learned the habits of animals and plants, and shaped tools suited to different needs. None of this requires us to exaggerate. It simply asks us to respect the scale of the unwritten past. The danger comes from both directions. On one side, we may underestimate prehistoric people and picture them as crude figures waiting for civilization to begin. On the other side, we may overcorrect and fill the silence with fantasy, turning every mystery into evidence of a lost advanced society. Both mistakes fail the past in different ways. The first makes early humans smaller than they were. The second uses them as a canvas for modern imagination. A truthful journey has to move more slowly than that. It has to stay close to what can be known, and just as close to what cannot be known. It has to ask how complexity begins before it becomes visible as a city, how memory works before it becomes an archive, how gathering places matter before they become capitals, and how a people can leave behind signs of order without leaving behind a written explanation of that order. In that sense, the title of this video is not a promise that we will uncover one hidden civilization and name it. It is an invitation to look at the deep human past without rushing to either disbelief or fantasy. Maybe the most important lost thing is not a kingdom. Maybe it is a scale of human experience that does not fit easily into the categories we inherited from later history. Before history, there were no historians waiting beside the fire, writing down what the group believed, feared, remembered, or hoped. There were only people living inside their own world, as fully as we live inside ours, unaware that one day others would search the ground for what little remained. And if we begin there, with humility rather than certainty, the question becomes quieter, but deeper. Not simply, did a lost civilization exist before history, but how much of human civilization has always depended on things that time is very good at taking away. Before writing became a way to hold the past still, memory had to do work that later generations would give to clay, paper, stone, and ink. It had to carry roots across land, the timing of migrations, the behavior of animals, the ripening of plants, the places where water might remain after dry months, the dangers of certain valleys, the meaning of certain stars, and the stories that told a group who they were. This is one of the most important things to understand when we ask whether a lost human civilization existed before history. A society does not become intelligent only when it begins to write. Writing changes what can be stored, compared, counted, and transmitted, but it does not create human memory from nothing. Long before written records, people already lived inside webs of remembered knowledge. A child did not learn the world from books or carved signs. A child learned by watching hands, by hearing repeated words, by walking behind older people, by being corrected, by listening at night, by seeing which plants were touched and which were avoided, by noticing how the adults read tracks in mud or snow. Every generation received a world that had already been interpreted by the generations before it. That interpretation was not casual. It could mean survival. If a group forgot the right season to move, the right way to preserve food, the right place to cross a river, or the right warning sign in the weather, the cost could be serious. So memory was not only private, it was social. And it belonged to the group, and the group protected it by repeating it. Some knowledge may have been kept in stories because stories are easier to remember than lists. Some may have been carried in songs, gestures, rituals, landmarks, or repeated journeys through the same landscape. A place on a hill, a bend in a river, a stone shape, a cave mouth, or a distant mountain could become part of a mental map shared by many people. To us, such a system may look fragile because it leaves little behind, but to the people who lived inside it, it could be strong, because it was renewed every time someone spoke, walked, taught, gathered, mourned, or returned. This matters directly to the idea of a lost civilization before history. If we only look for written archives, then prehistory appears silent. But if memory itself was the archive, then the silence we hear now may not reflect the silence of the past. It may only reflect the disappearance of the voices that once kept the archive alive. A community could have known its world deeply without ever carving that knowledge into a tablet. It could have held a long chain of inherited understanding without leaving us a document to prove its length. This does not mean we should pretend to know the exact stories they told or imagine details that cannot be recovered. It means we should recognize the kind of loss we are dealing with. When an oral world vanishes, it does not leave an empty library. It leaves scattered traces of the lives that once remembered. A hearth, a tool, a path, a burial, a pigment mark, a gathering place. These may be the last edges of a much larger memory system, one that once connected people to land, ancestors, danger, skill, and meaning. And perhaps this is why the question of a lost civilization before history should not begin with hidden cities, but with a quieter thought. Before people wrote history down, history may have lived in them. A memory archive does not survive by accident. It has to be practiced, protected, and woven into daily life so deeply that people do not experience it as a separate thing. In a world before writing, knowledge could not simply be placed somewhere and left alone. It had to be carried by bodies and renewed by use. A person might know where certain plants grew because they had walked there with an older relative many times. They might know when birds would pass through a valley because the sound and movement of those birds had been noticed year after year. They might know which stones made better cutting edges, which bones could become needles or points, which woods bent without breaking, and which places became dangerous after heavy rain. None of this needed to be written to be precise. It needed to be remembered correctly. This is why the idea of a lost civilization before history becomes more subtle when we look closely. The question is not only whether people built something large enough for us to find. It is also whether they built systems of knowledge that were large in another way, spread across memory, habit, landscape, and repeated instruction. Later civilizations would store part of their power in records. They could count grain, list debts, mark borders, and keep the names of rulers. Earlier communities stored power differently. They stored it in knowing how to remain alive in a changing world. They stored it in relationships between people, in who had the right to teach, who was trusted to remember, who knew certain routes, who understood healing plants, who could make tools, who could tell when the season had turned, and who could repeat the stories that gave meaning to shared places. If such a world disappeared, it would not collapse like a stone city. It would fade when the last people who knew its pathways stopped walking them, when a coastline drowned, when a group moved away, when children no longer learned the same names for the same hills, when a ritual place lost the voices that once returned to it. From the outside, after thousands of years, that loss might look like almost nothing. A few marks, a few objects, a scatter of bones. Yet inside the lived world, the loss could have been immense. This is not a claim that every prehistoric community was a civilization in the later urban sense. It is a reminder that civilization, if we use the word carefully, is not made only from buildings. It is also made from continuity. It is made from the ability of one generation to hand a meaningful world to the next. Before history, that handover depended on memory more than on archives. It depended on repetition, attention, patience, and belonging. A story might tell someone where to go, but also why that place mattered. A song might carry timing, direction, or warning. A ritual might preserve a social rule long after the original reason for it had become hard to explain. A familiar path could be both a route through land and a route through the mind. And because these things leave such delicate traces, we should be careful when we look back and see only fragments. The fragments may not show us the full shape of the system that produced them. They may be like a few surviving words from a language that once filled an entire valley. When we ask whether a lost human civilization existed before history, we may be asking whether there were human worlds whose true structure was carried in memory rather than in stone. If so, then much of what mattered most would be exactly what time could erase most easily. The more we think about memory before writing, the more the phrase lost civilization begins to change its shape. It no longer points only toward a buried capital or a vanished monument. It points towards something more fragile and more difficult to recover, a shared way of remembering the world, A written civilization can lose a library and still leave walls behind. An oral world can lose its people, and with them lose the living pattern that made its knowledge whole. This is why prehistory can feel so empty when we first look at it, even though it was filled with human attention. What remains for us is often separated from the mind that once gave it meaning. A stone tool in a museum may look small and silent, but in the hand of the person who made it, it belonged to a chain of teaching. Someone had learned how to choose the stone, where to strike, how much pressure to use, how to repair an edge, and when the tool was no longer useful. That knowledge did not begin with that one hand. It had moved through other hands before it. It may have been corrected by older makers, watched by children, repeated beside a fire, carried across seasons, and adapted when the group entered a new landscape. The object survives, but the full memory around it mostly does not. The same is true of a hearth. We may find the darkened soil where fire once burned, but we do not hear the conversations that took place around it. We do not know which stories were told there, which warnings were repeated, which names were remembered, which dead were spoken of, or which children first learned the shape of the wider world in that circle of light. And yet, if we are asking whether human beings before history had forms of civilization that later disappeared, these quiet scenes matter. Civilization is not only the moment when people build upward, it is also the moment when they begin to preserve knowledge beyond one lifetime. It is the long act of making sure that what one person learns does not die with them. Before writing, this depended on repetition so steady that it became part of life itself. Knowledge had to be attached to daily movement, to food, to weather, to tools, to kinship, to ceremonies, to the memory of places. A route was not just a line across land. It could be a remembered sequence of water sources, resting places, animal crossings, dangers, stories, and obligations. A gathering place was not just an open area where people happened to meet. It could become a point where memory was refreshed, where distant groups exchanged news, where marriages were arranged, where skills were copied, where stories became shared again after long separation. These are the kinds of structures that can be lost without leaving the kind of ruins we expect. They are social structures, mental structures, seasonal structures. They may have shaped lives as powerfully as walls, but time does not preserve them in the same way. This is why we must keep returning to the central question carefully. Did a lost human civilization exist before history? If by civilization we mean a large urban state with writing, bureaucracy, permanent rulers and records, then we must not project that image backward without evidence. But if we are asking whether there were complex human worlds before writing, worlds with inherited knowledge, shared ritual, long-distance contact, skilled labor, and deep memory, then the answer becomes less simple and more interesting. The evidence does not allow us to invent whatever we wish. It does allow us to see that human beings were already capable of maintaining meaning across generations long before history became written. Perhaps some of those worlds were small. Perhaps some were widely connected. Perhaps some gathered only during certain seasons, and then scattered again across rivers, forests, coasts, and plains. Their shape may not have resembled the civilizations we know from schoolbooks. They may not have had borders, capitals, or royal names, but they could still have possessed a kind of order that mattered deeply to those who lived inside it. And when such an order disappeared, there may have been no final inscription, no official collapse, no last king, no burning archive. There may have been only a broken chain of memory, a path no longer walked, a song no longer taught, a coast no longer above water, a place once known by everyone becoming, slowly, only land again. In that sense, the first great archive of humanity was not a building. It was the human mind joined to other human minds, held together by voice, attention, and return. And because that archive was alive, it could be powerful. But because it was alive, it could also die. The next thing we have to understand is colder and less romantic. The deep past is not only silent because people did not write, it is silent because most things do not survive. Archaeology is often imagined as a patient search through ruins, as if the earth keeps everything safely and simply waits for us to dig it up. But time is not a museum. Time breaks, scatters, dissolves, burns, floods, buries, crushes, and forgets. A human world can be real and still leave very little behind. This matters deeply when we ask whether a lost human civilization existed before history, because the question depends not only on what once existed, but on what could have lasted long enough for us to see. Stone lasts better than wood. Fired clay lasts better than woven fibre. Bone sometimes lasts, but often does not. Skin, bark, rope, baskets, clothing, shelters made from branches, tools made from plant material, painted hides, carved wood, and objects carried from camp to camp may vanish almost completely. Even the places where people lived can disappear if they were built lightly, used seasonally, or placed in landscapes that later changed. A settlement of stone can become a ruin. A camp made of wood, hide, grass, and earth may become only a dark stain in the soil, if even that remains. So when we look backward and see fewer traces, we should not always assume there was less life. Sometimes there was simply less that could endure. This does not give us permission to fill the empty spaces with fantasy. It gives us a responsibility to think carefully about the difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence. Those are not the same thing, but they are also not opposites that allow us to believe anything. If no trace remains, we cannot describe a society in detail. We cannot name its leaders, invent its rituals, or claim that it had knowledge we cannot prove. But we can recognize that the surviving record is uneven. It favors certain materials, certain climates, certain landscapes, and certain ways of living. A dry cave may preserve what an open plain destroys. A buried stone tool may survive where a wooden tool decays. A desert may keep traces that a wet forest erases. A cold place may preserve a body for thousands of years, while a warm and humid place may return almost everything to the soil. The past we study is therefore not the full past. It is the part of the past that passed through the filter of survival, and that filter can change the way human history appears to us. It can make societies that built in stone seem more important than societies that built in wood. It can make settled places seem more advanced than mobile ones. It can make written peoples seem more intelligent than oral peoples, not because they were always more intelligent, but because they left behind evidence that speaks in a form we can read. Before history, many communities may have lived in ways that were rich, organized, and carefully adapted, but their materials were humble, their movements were seasonal, and their most important knowledge was carried in people rather than stored in objects. When those people were gone, when their shelters collapsed, when the rain softened their paths, when roots moved through their hearths, when rivers shifted, when animals scattered bones, when later humans reused the same land, the old world could become almost invisible. This is the cold truth of archaeology. It does not reveal everything that happened. It reveals what survived, what was found, what was recognized, and what could be interpreted without forcing the evidence to say more than it can say. For a sleep-like story about a lost civilization before history, this truth is important because it keeps the imagination honest. We are allowed to wonder. We are allowed to ask whether human complexity was older, quieter, and more fragile than our usual image of civilization. But we are not allowed to turn silence into certainty. The silence itself must be treated as part of the subject. It tells us that the human past was larger than the record, but it does not tell us exactly what filled every missing space. Somewhere beneath later soil, beneath river mud, beneath forests, beneath cities built over older camps, there may be traces of people who once understood their world with great precision. Some traces may still be waiting. Some may already be gone forever. And between those two possibilities, the question remains open, not because anything can be true, but because time has taken away so much of what truth would need. One of the most misleading things about the archaeological record is that it can make permanence look like importance. What lasts begins to seem central, while what disappears begins to seem secondary. even when the vanished things may have shaped daily life more deeply than the surviving ones. A stone blade may remain after 10,000 years, but the hand that used it, the lesson that taught it, the wooden handle that held it, the cord that tied it, the pouch that carried it, and the story of where the stone came from may all be gone. A ring of post holes may suggest that something once stood there, but the roof, walls, smoke, voices, sleeping bodies, stored food, and gestures of care inside that shelter have vanished. A burial may survive as bones and objects, but grief itself does not fossilize. The person who placed a hand on the ground, who remembered the dead, who chose a shell, a tool, or a pigment to leave beside the body, is beyond our reach, except through the trace of the act. This is why the question of a lost human civilization before history cannot be answered only by asking whether we have found ruins large enough to impress us. We must also ask what kinds of human organization could have existed in materials too fragile to last. It is possible for a society to build meaning in wood, skin, fiber, song, root, ceremony, and seasonal return. It is possible for people to create a stable world without creating permanent buildings. A mobile group may carry its architecture with it, not as stone walls, but as knowledge of where shelter can be made, where wind is blocked, where reeds grow, where hides can be stretched, where firewood can be found, and where the ground stays dry after rain. To someone searching only for cities, this looks like absence. To the people living it, it may have been a highly ordered way of life. The land itself could function like a large living structure, with each place holding a memory of use. A bend in a river might be a fishing place, a ridge might be a lookout, a grove might be a source of medicine or wood. A cave might be a winter shelter, a meeting point, a place of images, or a place associated with the dead. None of this requires us to call every prehistoric landscape a civilization, but it does ask us to look at lost civilization with a softer, more careful eye. Perhaps the lost part is not only buildings. Perhaps it is arrangement. It is the way places, people, seasons, tasks, and memories fitted together. Archaeology can sometimes recover pieces of that arrangement, but rarely the whole pattern. The problem becomes even greater when we remember that many of the best places for human life were also the easiest to erase. Riverbanks shift. Floodplains bury old surfaces. Forest soils disturb and consume. Coasts move. Sea levels rise. Later people build on the same favourable ground again and again, mixing or destroying older traces. A place chosen because it was good for living may also be a place where evidence is difficult to preserve. A sheltered cave may protect a record, but many humans did not spend their entire lives in caves. They lived in open air, near water, along animal routes, in temporary camps, on edges of landscapes that were always changing. Their traces were exposed to rain, roots, insects, animals, fire, freezing, thawing, and later, human disturbance. Thousands of years later, the surviving evidence may be a thin and broken remnant of a much denser life. This is especially important for the time before written history, because writing gives later societies a second kind of survival. Even when buildings fall, a written sign can preserve names, categories, and intentions. Without writing, intention is harder to recover. We may see that stones were arranged, but not always why. We may see that people returned to a place, but not what they called it. We may see that objects travelled long distances, but not always whether they moved by trade, gift, migration, marriage, ritual, or chance. The evidence can point toward connection without giving us the full social map. That is why a truthful script must leave room for uncertainty, without turning uncertainty into mystery for its own sake. The deep past does not become more beautiful when we exaggerate it. It becomes more moving when we understand how little of it had a chance to remain. When a basket decays, we lose more than a container. We lose a technique, a rhythm of hands, a choice of plant fibers, a teaching moment, perhaps a pattern known to a group. When a wooden marker disappears, we may lose a boundary, a root sign, a memory of return. When a song dies, no excavation can recover its melody from the soil. The coldness of archaeology is not that it tells us early humans were simple, it is that it often cannot tell us how complex they were in the exact ways that mattered to them. So the question remains suspended between respect and restraint. There may have been worlds before history that were more organized than their surviving traces suggest. There may have been networks, meeting grounds, ritual cycles, and inherited knowledge systems whose outlines are now faint or broken. But the honest path is to follow the traces that remain and to admit where they stop. A lost civilization, if such a phrase can be used carefully, may not always leave a fallen tower. It may leave a few stones, a stain of fire, a worked edge, a path beneath later soil, and a silence that is not empty, but incomplete. There is one more reason the deep past is so difficult to hold clearly in the mind. Archaeology does not only depend on what survived, it also depends on what people have been able to find, where they have looked, what questions they were asking, and what earlier generations of researchers were prepared to recognize. A trace can sit in the ground for thousands of years and still remain unknown. It can be destroyed before anyone notices it. It can be found but misunderstood. It can be too faint to fit the expectations of its time. This means that our picture of prehistory is not fixed like a completed map. It is more like a dim landscape slowly lit in separate places. One area becomes visible because a cave preserved bones. Another becomes visible because dry conditions protected plant remains. Another because a road, a quarry, a farm, or a construction project cut through old ground by accident. But between these lit areas there are still wide shadows. Some shadows may hide nothing unusual. Some may hide ordinary human life that was never preserved well. Some may hold evidence that future tools will understand better than we can now. This is why the question of a lost human civilization before history has to remain careful and patient. The missing parts of the record are real, but they are not a blank space where any story can be placed. They are a warning about limits. We know that early humans could think, plan, teach, travel, adapt, and remember. We know that they left signs of skill and meaning long before writing. We also know that many claims about lost ancient civilizations go far beyond the evidence and become stories people want to believe because they make the past feel more dramatic. A truthful journey must resist that pull. It must allow the past to be mysterious without forcing it to become sensational. The strongest mystery may not be that there was once a hidden world more advanced than ours. The stronger mystery is that ordinary human intelligence, repeated over thousands of generations, can be almost invisible after enough time has passed. A group may have known a coastline intimately, naming its inlets, its fishing places, its dangerous currents, its safe stones, its seasonal birds, its shell beds, its shelters, and its stories of return. Then the sea rose, slowly by human experience, quickly by geological memory, and that coastline was gone. Later, from our side of time, we may look at the water and see only a natural boundary. But for people who lived there, it may once have been a world of paths, fires, graves, gatherings, and remembered names. A forest may now cover old camps. A river may have carried away the bank where generations returned. A modern town may stand above places where older people once slept, worked, and told stories, leaving traces too disturbed to read. In such cases, the loss is not imaginary. It is physical, environmental, and historical. But what exactly was lost cannot always be described. That is the hard balance. We can say that the record is incomplete. We cannot use incompleteness as proof of a particular vanished civilization. We can say that prehistoric people were far more capable than old stereotypes allowed. We cannot say that every unexplained stone, flood story, or ancient structure belonged to one hidden global culture. We can say that time erases soft materials and living memory. We cannot pretend to hear words that were never written down. This discipline, this refusal to overclaim, is not a weakness. It is what gives the question its real weight. If we stay honest, then the silence of prehistory becomes deeper, not smaller. It becomes the silence of real lives that cannot fully return, rather than the silence of a puzzle waiting for a dramatic answer. And this helps us understand why the idea of a lost civilization before history should be treated less like a treasure hunt and more like an exercise in humility. The past is not obligated to leave evidence in the form we prefer. It does not arrange itself to satisfy modern curiosity. It gives us fragments, and from those fragments we build cautious understanding. A stone tool may tell us about skill, but not the full lesson. A burial may tell us about care, but not the whole grief. A monument may tell us that people gathered, but not everything they believed when they stood there. A drowned landscape may suggest lost human worlds, but not allow us to name them. So, by the end of this first cold lesson, the question has changed again. We are no longer asking only whether a lost civilization existed before history. We are asking what kinds of human worlds could disappear without looking, to us, like a disappearance at all. We are asking how much has been erased not because it was unimportant, but because it was made of perishable things, living voices, changing land, and memory. And once we understand that, the search becomes quieter. It becomes less about finding a single astonishing answer, and more about learning to read the small surviving signs without making them say too little or too much. After we understand how much the deep past can lose, we can look more carefully at the places where something did survive. Not a whole written world, not a complete explanation, only enough to make us pause. Across prehistory, there are sites where people did more than pass through, eat, sleep, and move on. They returned. They gathered. They shaped stone, marked surfaces, arranged space, and sometimes built things that required planning beyond a single day or a single household. These places are important because they sit near the edge of the question we are asking. Did a lost human civilization exist before history? If we expect the answer to look like a city with streets, rulers, and written records, then many early gathering places will seem too strange or too incomplete to count. But if we are asking how human beings began to organize meaning before cities, then these places become central. They show us that long before written history, people could create locations that mattered to more than immediate survival. A place might become important because animals passed nearby. It might become important because water, stone, shelter, or plants were found there. But it could also become important because people chose to return to it for reasons that went beyond food. They may have met other groups there. They may have exchanged materials, partners, stories, skills, or obligations. They may have remembered the dead there. They may have marked time there. They may have made images, raised stones, carved forms, or arranged the ground in ways that turned an ordinary landscape into a shared place. We have to speak carefully, because for many prehistoric sites we do not know exactly what people believed. We cannot simply say what a place meant in their own words, but the repeated use of a place, the effort placed into it, and the care shown in arranging it can still tell us something. It tells us that human life was not only scattered movement, it had centers of attention, even before those centers became towns. This is one of the most interesting steps towards civilization, if we use the word slowly. Civilization may not begin when people first build a city. It may begin earlier, when people start agreeing, across time, that a certain place matters. That agreement does not need a written law. It can live in memory. It can be carried by paths, seasonal returns, rituals, stories, and the simple fact that each generation brings the next generation back. A child taken to such a place may not be reading an inscription, but the child is learning that the world has meaningful locations and that the group belongs to them in a particular way. When people return again and again, the landscape becomes more than background. It becomes part of social memory. And once a landscape becomes memory, it can hold a group together even without walls. This is why early gathering places are so valuable for our question. They do not prove a lost empire. They do not prove a single forgotten global civilization. But they do show that before history, human beings were capable of creating shared centers. These centers may have been temporary, seasonal, or ceremonial. They may have filled with people only at certain times, then fallen quiet again. They may have been alive with voices for a few days or weeks, then left to wind, animals, and weather. Yet their importance may have lasted in memory far longer than their occupation lasted in time. A city is present every day. A gathering place can be powerful, even if it is used only when the season, the moon, the herds, the weather, or the inherited story calls people back. This kind of place changes how we think about what might be lost before history. It suggests that there may have been forms of coordination that did not look permanent from the outside, but were deeply stable from within. People could belong to a network without living in one fixed settlement. They could share meanings without writing them down. They could build something not because they were already a state, but because gathering itself had become important. And perhaps this is where the idea of a lost civilization becomes more grounded. Not a secret kingdom hidden from archaeology, but a layer of human organization that may have existed between small daily life and later urban society. A world of meeting places, remembered routes, shared signs, seasonal assemblies, and carefully maintained meanings. Much of it would leave only fragments, but those fragments remind us that civilization, if it has deep roots, may have grown first not out of walls, but out of return. One place often enters this conversation because it unsettles the old, simple picture of how civilization began. Göbekli Tepe, in what is now southeastern Turkey, is not proof of a lost empire before history, and it should not be treated as a doorway to fantasy. Its real importance is quieter and stronger than that. The site contains monumental round oval and rectangular megalithic structures from the pre-pottery Neolithic period, roughly between 9,000, 600 and 8,200 BCE, made by hunter-gatherer communities, with distinctive T-shaped pillars carved with wild animals and other imagery. That alone is enough to make us pause. Not because it proves that there was a secret advanced civilization, but because it shows that people who were not yet living in the later form of urban civilization could still organize labor, shape stone, return to a meaningful place, and create something that outlasted ordinary daily life. This is the careful lesson. The old expectation was often that farming came first, then permanent villages, then surplus, then social complexity, then temples and monuments. But sites like Göbekli Tepe make that line feel less straight. They suggest that gathering, ritual, shared belief, and symbolic places may have helped pull people together before the full shape of settled urban life appeared. In other words, people may have built meaningful centers before they built cities. They may have gathered around memory and ritual before they gathered around markets, palaces, or written laws. And if that is true, then the roots of civilization may not begin only in administration and agriculture. They may also begin in the older human need to return, to mark, to gather, to remember, and to stand together before something larger than the needs of one day. We should be very careful here. We do not know the full meaning of the pillars. We do not know the exact words people used for the place. We do not know whether every image had one meaning, many meanings, or meanings that changed over time. We should not say more than the evidence allows, but we can say that the effort required to quarry, move, carve, arrange, and maintain such structures implies coordination. People had to share a reason strong enough to bring them there and keep the work going. The reason may not have been economic in the later sense. It may not have been political in the way a palace is political. It may have been social, ritual, seasonal, ancestral, or something we do not have a modern word for. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the truth. The site matters because it sits in a space between categories. It is not a city. It is not a written civilization. It is not a simple camp either. It asks us to imagine forms of organization that do not fit neatly into the ladder we sometimes build in our minds. First primitive bands, then villages, then towns, then civilization. Human life was not a ladder. It was more like a landscape, with different paths opening in different places. Some paths led toward farming, some toward larger settlements, some toward long-distance exchange, some toward ceremonial gathering. Some left many traces, and some almost none. Göbekli Tepe survives because stone was used, because the site was preserved well enough to be studied, and because archaeologists eventually recognized its importance. But it also reminds us of a larger possibility. If one such place survived, how many places of meeting, memory, and meaning were made in materials that did not survive? How many gatherings left only disturbed soil? How many wooden posts decayed? How many seasonal centers disappeared beneath farms, towns, rivers, forests, or sea? This does not prove they were there in any specific place. It only teaches us that human coordination before history could be more surprising than older assumptions allowed. And that changes the question of a lost civilization. Perhaps we should not imagine one hidden kingdom waiting to be named. Perhaps we should imagine a broader threshold, a long and uneven period when human groups were learning to create shared centers without yet becoming the urban civilizations of later history. At such a threshold, the difference between a camp, a sanctuary, a meeting ground, and the beginning of something larger may not have been as clear as our words make it seem. A place could be empty for part of the year and still be central to a people's world. A place could have no king and still require leadership. A place could have no writing and still preserve memory. A place could have no city walls and still gather people into a shared order. This is why the evidence from early monumental sites should make us humble, not reckless. It does not give us permission to claim a vanished civilization beyond proof. It gives us something more valuable, a reason to question whether civilization began only when it became visible in the forms we expected. Before history wrote names down, people were already making places that asked to be remembered, and sometimes against the odds, the stones remembered for them. Göbekli Tepe is powerful because it gives us a visible example, but it should not become the whole story. If we make one site carry too much meaning, we fall into another kind of mistake. We begin to treat a single place as if it must explain the entire hidden past. But the question of a lost human civilization before history is larger than any one mound, any one circle of stones, any one carved pillar, or any one discovery. The deeper lesson is that human beings were capable of creating meaningful places long before they left written records explaining those places to us. And once we accept that, the world before history becomes less empty, but also more difficult to simplify. A gathering place might begin for practical reasons. People might come because water was nearby, because animals crossed the land at certain times, because stone for tools could be found there, because the ground was sheltered, because different groups could meet without travelling too far from their own seasonal ranges. Yet after enough returns, practical places can become remembered places. A place where food was shared can become a place where alliances are renewed. A place where strangers meet can become a place where marriages are arranged, where news travels, where songs are exchanged, where young people see that their own group is part of a larger human world. A place where the dead are remembered can become more than a location on the land. It can become a location in time, a bridge between those who came before and those still learning how to belong. This is one of the quiet roots of civilization, not only settling, but returning, not only building, but recognizing, not only surviving, but giving certain places a meaning that lasts longer than one visit. Before history, such places may have formed a kind of invisible map, not a map drawn on skin or stone for us to read, but a map carried in memory. People may have known where to meet at a certain season, where certain materials came from, where stories were attached to hills, springs, caves, rivers, cliffs, or open ground. Some of these places may have been small. Some may have drawn people from far away. Some may have been used for generations and then forgotten when climate shifted, when animals moved, when groups changed their routes, or when the reasons for gathering faded. If they were built with stone, a trace might remain. If they were built with wood, hide, earth, fibre, sound, and memory, almost nothing might survive. This does not make them imaginary. It only makes them hard to recover. And this is where the word lost becomes more honest. A lost civilization does not have to mean a vanished superpower. It can mean a lost layer of human connection, a pattern of seasonal gathering, a network of remembered places, a system of shared meanings that once helped people coordinate their lives. We may never be able to call such a thing by its own name, because its own name was spoken, not written. We may never know whether people thought of themselves as one people, many groups, visitors, kin, neighbors, rivals, or guests. We may never know whether a gathering place felt sacred, practical, ancestral, ordinary, or all of these at once. But we can recognize that the roots of organized human life may have grown through these repeated acts of return. Later cities would make central places permanent. They would build walls, store food, assign work, keep records, and give power a more visible shape. Earlier gathering places may have done something different. They may have allowed people to become connected without living together all year. They may have allowed knowledge to travel between groups. They may have made identity wider than the small daily circle. They may have taught people that a shared place could hold a shared memory. That may sound gentle, but it is not small. It is one of the foundations from which more visible civilization could eventually grow. The important thing is not to rush. We should not look at every old stone and say, "Here is a lost civilization." We should not look at every mystery and turn it into a hidden empire. But we also should not look at the absence of cities and conclude that nothing complex was happening. Between the camp and the city, between the path and the road, between memory and writing, there may have been many human arrangements that mattered deeply and disappeared quietly. They may have been too temporary to become ruins, too oral to become history, too local to become an empire, and yet too meaningful to be dismissed as simple. In that space, the question of this video becomes calmer and more precise. Maybe what existed before history was not one lost civilization waiting beneath the ground, but many beginnings of civilization, scattered, seasonal, fragile, remembered, and only sometimes preserved. Some began around stone, some around water, some around animals, some around the dead, some around stories that no longer have voices. And if we listen carefully to what the surviving places suggest, without making them speak beyond their evidence, they tell us something humbling. Human beings were gathering around meaning long before they gathered around written history. They were making centers before they made cities. They were building worlds before those worlds had names that could survive. Some of the most important lost places in the human past may not be buried under sand or hidden beneath forest roots. They may be underwater. This does not mean we should imagine glittering cities at the bottom of the sea, or claim that oceans are hiding an advanced world that archaeology has refused to accept. The real story is quieter, and in some ways more powerful. During and after the end of the last ice age, sea levels changed, coastlines moved, and large areas that had once been dry land were slowly covered. For people living at the time, these were not abstract geological events. They were changes to the places where families walked, hunted, gathered shellfish, found fresh water, watched birds, buried their dead, returned season after season, and taught children the names of the land. A coastline is often one of the richest places for human life. It offers water, fish, shellfish, birds, plants, driftwood, travel routes, and meeting points between land and sea. It is not hard to imagine that many prehistoric communities would have been drawn to such edges, just as people have been drawn to coasts throughout history. But the very places that may have supported life well were also among the places most vulnerable to disappearance. When the sea moved inland, it did not only cover empty ground. It could cover camps, paths, hunting places, gathering places, stone scatters, hearths, and landscapes of memory. Later, when we stand on a modern shore and look outward, it is easy to forget that the line between land and sea was not always where it is now. What looks like open water may once have been a valley, a plain, a marsh, a riverbank, or a place where people knew every sound of the season. This matters directly to the question of a lost human civilization before history, because some of the missing evidence may not be missing because it never existed. It may be missing because the ground itself has moved beyond ordinary reach. Doggerland is one of the clearest examples often used to help modern people understand this. It was a now submerged landscape in the southern North Sea that once connected Britain with continental Europe, and research projects have used marine seismic data, sediment cores, and environmental evidence to reconstruct parts of that lost terrain. Scholars describe it not as a drowned empire, but as a Mesolithic landscape of rivers, wetlands, and habitable environments where people and animals once lived before rising seas transformed it. That distinction is important. Doggerland gives us a real lost world, but not in the fantasy sense. It was a real landscape, and it helps show how human places can disappear beneath the sea without leaving the kind of ruins people expect from civilization. If people lived, moved, gathered, and remembered there, much of their world would now be difficult to study, not because it was imaginary, but because it lies under water, sediment, and time. The same broader problem exists in many parts of the world. Late Ice Age and early Holocene coastlines were often different from modern coastlines, and archaeological evidence from those older shorelines can be deeply submerged or difficult to locate. This gives the idea of a lost civilization a different mood. It does not invite us to invent palaces beneath the waves. It asks us to imagine ordinary but meaningful human worlds that were real enough to be lived in and fragile enough to vanish from view. A family might return to the same inlet every year. A group might meet near a river mouth because fish came there in season. Certain stones, trees, cliffs, or shell beds might have become landmarks in memory. People might have had names for places that are now nameless to us because the names were spoken and the places are drowned. No written map preserved them. No stone wall marks them from above the water. The sea did not need to destroy a city to erase a world. It only needed to cover the ground where memory was attached, and once that happens, the archaeological record becomes not just broken but displaced. The evidence may still exist in fragments, buried below marine sediments or scattered by waves and currents, but finding it is difficult, slow, and uncertain. So when we ask whether anything like a lost civilization existed before history, the underwater past reminds us to be humble. The most likely losses may not be spectacular in the way popular imagination wants. They may be human, coastal, seasonal, and quiet. They may be the loss of places where people gathered before writing, before permanent cities, before anyone could leave a record saying, "This shore was ours, this river had a name, this path led home." To understand why drowned landscapes matter so much, we have to imagine the coast not as a line on a modern map, but as a living zone that once moved through time. The shore was not only where land ended, it was where many kinds of life met. Fresh water flowed towards salt water. Fish moved with tides and seasons. Birds gathered in marshes. Shellfish waited in shallow places. Driftwood arrived from elsewhere. Reeds, grasses, stones, clay, and animal tracks could all be found near the shifting edge. For prehistoric people, such places may have offered food, materials, travel routes, and signs that could be read by those who knew how to read them. A low tide could reveal what high water covered. A river mouth could become a meeting place. A sheltered bay could hold memories of repeated returns. A sandbar, a cliff, a lagoon, or a chain of islands could shape the movement of people for generations. Yet these are exactly the places that sea level rise could remove from the visible world. When we speak of a lost human civilization before history, we often imagine sudden destruction, a dramatic fall, a city swallowed in one night. But much of the real loss may have happened more slowly, almost too slowly for one generation to feel as a single catastrophe. The shoreline moved, the marsh changed, the old path became wetter. The place where people once crossed became difficult. The fresh water tasted different. The familiar hunting ground became tidal. A camp used by grandparents was no longer safe for children. A burial place near the old edge became threatened by water. A story that once pointed to a real hill or river bend began to point toward a place that no one could visit in the same way. Over enough generations, a whole landscape could pass from homeland to memory, and then from memory into silence. This is not a fantasy about a hidden empire. It is a sober reminder that some of the most attractive places for human life were also some of the least likely to remain available to archaeologists on dry land. If we search only where the modern land surface exists, we may be searching only part of the old human world. The rest may lie beyond the beach, under silt, under sand, under water darkened by depth and movement. Even when traces remain there, they are difficult to interpret. Waves can scatter objects, currents can move sediments, organic materials can decay. Later marine life can disturb old surfaces. A tool found underwater may be hard to connect to the exact camp, task, or memory it once belonged to. The sea does not preserve a human world in a simple, gentle way. It covers, rearranges, hides, and sometimes protects only fragments. This makes drowned prehistory both important and uncertain. It widens our sense of what may be missing, but it also warns us not to speak too confidently. We can say that many ancient coastlines are now submerged. We can say that people likely use some of those coastlines because coastal resources have long been valuable to humans. We can say that some evidence from those landscapes is hard to find, but we cannot turn every drowned shelf into a lost civilization. We cannot claim cities, kings, temples, or writing unless the evidence supports them. The value of the underwater past is not that it proves the most dramatic version of the title. Its value is that it makes the quieter version impossible to ignore. Before written history, people may have lived in places that no longer exist as land. They may have had roots that are now beneath waves. They may have known seasonal patterns tied to shores that have shifted far away from where we stand today. They may have gathered in places that were never meant to become ruins because they were made of sand, fire, shell, wood, skin, and repeated memory. If those places vanished, what was lost was not only physical ground, it was orientation. It was the way people understood where they were in the world. A child taught to follow the curve of a shore would inherit a map made from walking, listening, smelling, watching birds, and remembering the words of older people. When the shore changed, that map had to change too. Some knowledge adapted. Some was carried inland. Some may have survived as story. Some disappeared because the place that held it disappeared. This is why the sea gives the question such a deep, quiet weight. It reminds us that history is not only written by people, it is also shaped by climate, water, erosion, and time. A human world can be lost without a war, without a collapse, without an invasion, without a final burning city. It can be lost because the ground of memory itself is slowly taken away. And when that happens before writing, the loss becomes even harder to measure. There may be no document saying what was abandoned, no list of families who moved, no lament carved into stone, no official memory of the old shore. Only later fragments, if we are fortunate. A worked flint, a bone, a submerged tree stump, traces in sediment, a shape on the seafloor that suggests a river once ran there. These fragments do not tell us everything, but they change the way we listen. They tell us that the human past is not fully contained on the land we can walk today. Some of it lies underwater, not as a myth waiting to become spectacle, but as a reminder that many ordinary human worlds have been removed from sight. And perhaps that is one of the most honest meanings of a lost civilization before history. Not a perfect city hidden below the waves, but a coastline of memory once lived in carefully, now beyond the reach of speech. The thought of drowned landscapes also changes the emotional shape of the word lost. A lost world underwater does not have to be a place of towers, statues, or impossible machines. It can be a place where people once knew how to live. That may sound smaller, but it is closer to the human truth. For the people who lived near ancient shores, the land was not an archaeological layer. It was familiar. It had directions, dangers, shelters, food, sounds, smells, and memories. Certain stretches of coast may have been known for shellfish. Certain river mouths may have been known for fish runs. Certain higher grounds may have been used when storms came. Certain stones, trees, cliffs, or sand ridges may have helped people find their way. If groups returned to the same places across many generations, the coast could become part of their identity. It could hold stories, warnings, family memories, meeting points, and perhaps ceremonies whose meanings are now beyond recovery. When water covered those places, It did not merely cover soil, it covered a remembered world. This is why the underwater past matters so strongly to the question of whether a lost human civilization existed before history. It gives us a real form of loss that does not require exaggeration. We do not need to imagine a perfect city beneath the sea. We only need to understand that some of the best places for human life at the end of the Ice Age are no longer where we can easily study them. A world can disappear from the record because the record itself was moved underwater, and because the people who lived there did not write, the loss became even deeper. If a later literate society lost a coastal town, there might still be documents, names, accounts, maps, or references in another city. But when a prehistoric coast was lost, its memory depended on living people. If they moved away, adapted, merged with other groups, or died without passing on every detail, the old shore could fade from human memory as well as from the land. This kind of disappearance leaves no clean ending. There is no final page, no last ruler, no official date of collapse. There is only a slow change in where people can stand, where they can gather, and what they can still teach their children from direct experience. Over time, a place that once belonged to daily life may become a story. Later, the story may become less exact. Later still, it may disappear completely. This possibility should make us careful when we think about myths, flood memories, and tales of lost lands. It is reasonable to understand why humans might remember water as a force that takes places away. Many communities across the world have lived with floods, storms, river changes, and shifting coasts. But it would not be honest to take every old story of water and declare it proof of one lost civilization. A memory of flooding is not the same as evidence for an advanced prehistoric state. A drowned landscape is not automatically a drowned city. A gap in the record is not a hidden empire waiting to be named. The honest value of these stories and landscapes is different. They remind us that human memory and changing land have always been connected. They remind us that what people called home could become unreachable. They remind us that the past may have contained many local worlds that were real, meaningful, and complex in their own terms, even if they did not become civilizations in the later urban sense. This is the balance this section needs to hold. On one side, we should not flatten the ancient coastal world into emptiness. On the other side, we should not turn the sea into a screen for our fantasies. Between those mistakes is a quieter truth. The end of the Ice Age and the early Holocene were not only environmental transitions, they were human experiences. People had to adjust to changing coastlines, changing resources, changing routes, and changing gathering places. Some groups may have moved inland, some may have followed the coast as it shifted, some may have changed their seasonal rounds, some may have lost access to places that had held meaning for generations. We cannot know every detail, but we can understand the kind of pressure such changes created. A place where people once met may have become shallow water. A familiar path may have vanished beneath mud. A landmark used for teaching may have disappeared. A burial place may have been eroded or submerged. A shoreline that once gave a group orientation may have become only a memory told by older voices. If we return to the title, the answer remains open but more grounded. Did a lost human civilization exist before history? Perhaps not in the dramatic form that popular imagination often wants, but lost human worlds certainly did exist. Some were lost to decay, some to silence, some to migration, some to later building, some to water. And among those lost worlds, there may have been forms of coordination, gathering, memory, exchange, and ritual that we can only glimpse now through fragments. That is not a small thing. It means the unwritten past was not simply waiting for history to begin. It was already full of people making sense of their world, and sometimes losing that world slowly without leaving behind words to explain the loss. The sea in this part of the story is not a monster and not a magical doorway. It is a patient force. It covers what once was land. It softens edges. It scatters traces. It hides old surfaces beneath new water. And beneath that water may lie not the proof of a single vanished civilization, but something just as humbling, the remains of many human places where memory once had a shore. When people hear the word civilization, they often imagine a place that stays still, a city, a capital, a permanent center where roads meet, food is stored, rulers sit, and records are kept. Because of that image, movement can appear to be the opposite of civilization. If a group moved with the seasons, followed animals, shifted camps, or returned to different places at different times of year, modern eyes may be tempted to see that life is simple, temporary, or incomplete. But this is another habit we have to question carefully. Movement does not always mean disorder. In many environments, movement can be a form of knowledge. It can be a planned relationship with the land, built from memory, timing, cooperation, and inherited skill. A group that moves badly may suffer. A group that moves well may survive for generations in a world that changes constantly. This matters to the question of a lost human civilization before history, because complexity does not always require walls. Sometimes it requires coordination across space. It requires knowing when to leave, where to go, who travels together, what can be carried, what must be left behind, where food will be found later, where dangers increase, where another group may be met, and where children, elders, tools, fire, and memory can be kept safe along the way. Such a life may leave fewer ruins than a city, but it does not follow that it had fewer rules. A mobile society can have deep structure. It can have obligations about sharing meat, rules about marriage, expectations about teaching, knowledge about healing, customs around death, and stories that bind people to particular places even if they do not live in those places all year. It can have specialists of a quiet kind, the person who knows how to make a certain tool, the person who remembers a long route, the person who reads weather well, the person who knows plants, the person whose voice carries old stories, the person trusted to settle tension, the person who understands animals in a way others depend on. None of these roles need a palace to matter. None need a written title, yet they can shape the life of the group with real force. If we only call a society complex when it becomes settled, then we miss a large part of human possibility. Before history, some communities may have been complex, not because they built upward, but because they connected many moving parts without writing them down. They may have linked seasonal camps, gathering places, hunting grounds, toolstone sources, water points, burial places, and meeting zones into a living system. To us, thousands of years later, those places may appear as scattered evidence. A tool here, a hearth there, a few bones somewhere else, a patch of pigment in a shelter, a distant material found far from its source. But for the people inside the system, those fragments were not separate. They belonged to a pattern of movement and return. This is why complexity without cities is so important for this video. It keeps us from making the question too narrow. Did a lost human civilization exist before history? Perhaps the answer depends partly on whether we are willing to see organization in something other than settlement. A city gathers people by keeping them in one place. A mobile network gathers people differently, by bringing them back to certain places at certain times, by carrying relationships across distance, by making memory do the work that streets and documents would later do. This kind of organization is harder to see, because it does not always harden into ruins, but it can still be real. It can still be inherited. It can still be fragile, and when it disappears, the loss may not look like a collapse. It may look like a route no longer used, a meeting season no longer kept, a skill no longer taught, a place no longer visited, a network slowly breaking until the remaining traces seem unrelated. The danger, again, is to say too much. We should not pretend that every moving group was a civilization in the later sense, but we should also not treat movement as proof of simplicity. Human beings lived for most of their existence without cities, and during that long time they learned to organize life through memory, kinship, return, exchange, and attention to land. Some of that organization may have reached levels that surprise us, because we have been trained to look for permanence as the sign of complexity. But perhaps, before history, Some of the most intelligent human systems were not permanent in stone. They were permanent in practice. They lasted because people repeated them. Season after season, child after child, journey after journey. And if those practices vanished before writing could preserve them, then a whole structure of life could be lost while leaving only the faintest outline on the earth. Complexity without cities can also appear in the movement of materials. A small object can travel farther than a person. A stone shaped in one region can end up many days or weeks away from the place where it was found. A shell from the coast can appear far inland. Pigments, toolstones, ornaments, animal parts, and useful knowledge can move from hand to hand, group to group, season to season, until their path becomes wider than any single camp. When archaeologists find materials far from their natural source, they do not always know exactly how those materials travelled. They may have moved through direct journeys, exchange, gift-giving, marriage connections, seasonal meetings, shared rituals, or routes followed across generations. But even when the exact path is uncertain, the movement itself matters. It tells us that prehistoric people were not always isolated in small, sealed worlds. They could be connected across distance. They could know of other places, other groups, other materials, and perhaps other stories. This is one of the quieter foundations of civilization, not only living together in one large settlement, but maintaining relationships beyond the immediate circle. A city makes connection visible by concentrating people in one place. A prehistoric exchange network may make connection almost invisible, because the people remain spread across land, and only the travelled objects reveal the wider web. This web could be practical. A group might need better stone for cutting tools, hides from another area, shells for ornaments, or knowledge of where food was plentiful in a difficult season. But exchange is rarely only about objects. When something passes from one group to another, trust may pass with it, obligation may pass with it, news may pass with it, a story may travel, a technique may be copied, a marriage may link two groups that would otherwise meet only occasionally. A young person might learn that the world is larger than the valley they know best. In this sense, long-distance connection can create a kind of social memory that is wider than any one settlement. It can allow people to belong to overlapping circles, the family by the fire, the group that travels together, the neighbouring group met at a seasonal gathering, the distant people known through objects and stories. None of this requires writing. None of it requires a permanent capital. Yet it can still create a world with structure, expectation, and meaning. If we ask whether a lost human civilization existed before history, these networks force us to slow down before answering. A civilization in the later sense often depends on roads, trade, administration, measurement, and records. But before those visible systems, there may have been older forms of connection built from remembered routes and repeated encounters. A person might know not only where their own group would camp, but where another group might appear when the weather changed. They might know which people were safe to approach, which gifts were expected, which stories were shared, which boundaries should not be crossed. The map of such a world would not be drawn as lines on parchment. It would live in memory and behaviour. It would be taught indirectly through movement. Go here at this time. Avoid that place after rain. Meet them when the herds pass. Bring this material. Listen to that elder. Do not take more than the place can give. To us, after thousands of years, only pieces remain. A shell far from the sea, a blade made from stone whose source lies far away, a pigment whose colour travelled beyond its hill. These pieces do not prove a hidden empire. They do not prove one unified civilization before history. But they do make isolation a weaker assumption. They suggest that some prehistoric worlds were connected worlds. A second, and connection is one of the roots from which later complexity grows. When people exchange, they do more than move goods. They compare, they remember, they copy, they adapt, they carry information between landscapes. A new tool shape can spread. A ritual object can gain meaning beyond its place of origin. A distant material can become a sign of status, beauty, relationship, or memory. Over time, these movements can create patterns larger than daily survival. They can create shared expectations across distance. They can make certain meeting places important because they are not just local places, but points where the wider human world touches itself. This is why complexity without cities can be so difficult to see. Its architecture is not always made from walls. Sometimes its architecture is made from roots. Its foundations are not always buried stones. Sometimes they are trust, repetition, and knowledge of when and where to meet. Its records are not always written. Sometimes they are the objects that travelled, the styles that spread, the practices that continued long enough to leave a faint pattern in the ground. When such a system breaks, it may leave no dramatic ruin. A route stops being walked, a meeting place is forgotten, a material no longer arrives, a style fades. A connection between groups weakens until what was once a living network becomes only scattered evidence in separate archaeological sites. If we are not careful, we may look at those fragments and see only isolated camps. But if we look patiently, we may begin to sense the lost lines between them. This does not mean we should call every network a civilization. It means we should understand that civilization did not arise from emptiness. It grew from older habits of connection. Before cities could gather strangers behind walls, human beings had already learned to recognize strangers at a distance, exchange with them, marry among them, learn from them, and return to them. Perhaps some of the lost worlds before history were not lost cities, but lost networks, wide, seasonal, flexible, remembered, and almost invisible once the people who carried them were gone. There is another kind of complexity that becomes easy to miss when we look only for cities. It is the complexity of roles. Later civilizations often make roles visible through titles, buildings, clothing, seals, records, and authority that can be named. A ruler sits in a palace, a priest serves in a temple, a scribe writes in a script, a farmer works a field, a soldier carries a weapon. These categories can be imperfect, but they leave signs that later people can recognize. Before history, roles may have existed in quieter forms. They may not have been fixed for life, and they may not have created rigid classes in the way later states did. But people still depended on differences in skill, memory, judgment, age, experience, and trust. One person might be especially skilled at shaping stone. Another might understand animal movement. Another might know the safest route across a difficult landscape. Another might remember old stories with unusual care. Another might prepare hides, gather plants, calm disputes, tend the sick, guide children, or know when a place should be left alone. In a small group, these roles might not need names that survive. They could be known through practice. Everyone might understand who should be listened to in a storm, who should be followed on a hunt, who should teach a child how to prepare a tool, who should speak when grief entered the camp. This is not the same as a bureaucracy. It is not a state. It is not a city administration hidden in prehistoric clothing, but it is still social organization. It is still the shaping of human life through recognized responsibilities. And if we are asking whether something like a lost civilization existed before history, we have to pay attention to this layer, because civilization is not only made from places and objects. It is made from relationships that last long enough to guide behavior. A society can be small and still have expectations. It can be mobile and still have rules. It can lack writing and still have memory keepers, skilled makers, respected elders, healers, negotiators, teachers, and people whose knowledge makes the group more capable than any one person alone. The question is not whether these roles made prehistoric life identical to later urban civilization. They did not. The question is whether older forms of complexity prepared the ground from which later civilization could grow. When people know how to share responsibility, how to transfer skill, how to trust certain knowledge, how to gather beyond the household, and how to remember obligations across time, they already possess some of the human foundations of civilization, even if they do not yet possess its later architecture. This helps us see why complexity without cities is not a lesser subject. It may be the long human background behind the more visible civilizations that came later. Before grain was counted in storehouses, people had to understand fairness and distribution in smaller forms. Before laws were written, people had to have customs and consequences. Before temples were built, people had to gather around meanings they considered worth repeating. Before schools existed, children had to learn from adults with patience and correction. Before official maps, people had to move through remembered land. Before archives, people had to keep important knowledge alive in speech, gesture, and practice. None of these things prove a lost prehistoric empire, but together they show that the human capacity for civilization did not appear suddenly with writing. It was already being rehearsed in older, softer forms. It was rehearsed in the way a child watched a toolmaker's hand. It was rehearsed in the way food was shared after a difficult day. It was rehearsed in the way people returned to a meeting place, recognized distant kin, exchanged materials, listened to a story, or treated the dead with care. These acts may seem ordinary, but repeated over generations they create continuity, and continuity is one of the deep roots of civilization. If such a world vanished, its disappearance would be hard to detect, because its order was distributed across living people. There would be no central archive to burn, no palace to collapse, no city wall to fall outward into the dust. The loss would happen when knowledge stopped passing from old hands to young hands. It would happen when a meeting place was no longer visited, when a route became unsafe or forgotten, when a group scattered, when a language faded, when a coastline changed, when the last person who understood a certain story died without teaching it fully. From our side of time, that loss might appear as nothing more than a break in evidence. But inside the human world where it happened, it may have been the end of a whole arrangement of meaning. This is why we have to resist the simple picture that civilization equals cities, and everything before cities equals emptiness. The more honest picture is slower. Human complexity grew in layers. Some layers became visible as monuments, writing, agriculture, and states. Other layers remained close to the body: memory, teaching, kinship, movement, skill, and return. The visible layers are easier to name, but the invisible layers may be older. They may have carried human groups through tens of thousands of years before the first written histories began. So when we ask about a lost human civilization before history, the most grounded answer may not be a single yes or no. It may be a change in attention. We stop looking only for the signs of later civilization projected backward. We begin looking for older kinds of order that could be lost without ever becoming a city. We begin to understand that some human worlds were complex because they were flexible, not because they were fixed, because they remembered, not because they recorded, because they connected, not because they centralized. And perhaps the deepest loss before history is not that one great civilization disappeared without a trace. It is that many forms of human organization may have lived and died before anyone had the means to leave us their names. There is a point in this question where curiosity becomes dangerous if it is not handled with care. The idea of a lost human civilization before history naturally pulls the mind toward myths, flood stories, ancient ruins, strange alignments, and the feeling that something enormous has been hidden from us. That feeling is understandable. Human beings are drawn to missing chapters. We want the past to have a secret door. We want silence to mean that something dramatic is waiting behind it. But a truthful search cannot treat every silence as a clue, and every uncertainty as permission. This is where we have to slow down again. Myths and legends are not worthless. They can preserve emotions, landscapes, warnings, moral lessons, memories of disasters, and ways people understood their place in the world. A story about a flood may tell us that water was feared, remembered, or morally important to a community. A story about a vanished land may reflect real experiences of loss, migration, erosion, sea level change, or social collapse. A story about ancient ancestors may hold a group's sense of identity across many generations. These things matter, but they do not automatically become archaeological proof. A myth can be meaningful without being a literal report. A legend can contain old memory without giving us a map. A traditional story can point toward human experience without proving the existence of a hidden empire. If we forget this distinction, we begin to replace evidence with desire. We begin to hear what we want to hear in the gaps. And when the subject is a lost civilization before history, that mistake can become very tempting. Because there really are gaps. There really are drowned landscapes, vanished languages, destroyed organic materials, unfinished archaeological pictures, and sites whose meanings are not fully understood. But a gap is not a bridge to any conclusion we like. It is only a space where we must be more disciplined. If an ancient site is difficult to explain, the honest answer may be that we do not yet understand it fully. It is not automatically proof of a civilization more advanced than the evidence shows. If a stone structure required coordination, that tells us something important about human organization. It does not allow us to add writing, kings, science, or global power unless those things are actually supported. If several cultures tell stories about floods, that may reflect the human importance of flood events, changing rivers, coastlines, storms, and moral imagination. It does not prove that all those stories came from one single lost world. The danger of false certainty is that it looks like wonder, but it often makes the past smaller. It takes many different peoples, many different histories, many different landscapes, and forces them into one dramatic explanation. Instead of respecting complexity, it simplifies everything into a secret. That may feel exciting for a moment, but it is not fair to the people who actually lived before history. They do not need to be turned into builders of impossible machines to be interesting. They do not need to be made into a vanished super-civilization for their lives to matter. Their real intelligence was already astonishing enough to survive changing climates, to read landscapes, to remember without writing, to gather without states, to make meaning without leaving us a full explanation. A careful story must protect that truth. It must allow mystery, but not abuse it. It must allow uncertainty, but not sell uncertainty as proof. It must say, here is what we know, here is what we can reasonably wonder, here is where we must stop. That stopping point is not boring, it is honest. And in a video about whether a lost civilization existed before history, honesty is what keeps the question alive. If we answer too quickly with fantasy, the question becomes cheap. If we dismiss everything too quickly, the question becomes shallow. The better path is to remain between those two errors, listening to myth as human memory, reading archaeology as surviving evidence, and remembering that the silence before history is not an empty stage for modern imagination. It is the remains of real lives, and real lives deserve more than careless certainty. One reason false certainty spreads so easily is that it gives the mind a shape to hold. The real past is uneven, broken, and patient. A dramatic theory feels cleaner. It gathers scattered stones, flood stories, old maps, strange carvings, and unanswered questions into one simple pattern, and for a moment the world feels easier to understand. But the ease is misleading. A single explanation can become a net thrown over many things that do not truly belong together. Different cultures may build monuments for different reasons. Different peoples may remember floods because floods happen in many river valleys and coastal regions, not because they all inherited one story from one vanished source. Different symbols may look similar to modern eyes because human beings often return to simple shapes. Circles, lines, animals, hands, stars, water, spirals, bodies, paths. Similarity is worth noticing, but it is not proof by itself. A careful observer asks what the object is made of, where it was found, how it was dated, what else was nearby, whether the same pattern appears locally over time, and whether other explanations are more likely. A careless observer begins with the desired answer and then collects only the pieces that seem to support it. This is where a sleep audio about the deep past can do something useful for the listener. It can teach a slower kind of curiosity. Not the curiosity that jumps toward the largest claim, but the curiosity that stays with the evidence long enough to hear its limits. If a structure is very old, that is already meaningful. It does not need to become impossible. If prehistoric people moved heavy stones, That is already a sign of coordination, skill, and shared purpose. It does not need to be explained by lost technology beyond evidence. If a coastline was drowned, that is already a profound human loss. It does not need to hide a perfect city. If oral traditions remember water, fire, darkness, ancestors, or lost places, those traditions deserve respect as human expressions. They do not need to be forced into literal archaeology every time. The past becomes richer, not poorer, when we stop demanding that every mystery lead to the same answer. In fact, the most honest view may be more beautiful than the false one. Instead of one hidden civilization secretly explaining everything, we may have many human worlds, each adapted to its own land, each carrying its own memory, each solving problems in ways that made sense locally. Some built with stone, some with wood, some with earth, some with skin and fibre. Some left images, some left tools, some left only faint traces in soil. Some may have influenced others through exchange or migration. Some may have vanished almost completely. This is not as simple as one grand lost empire, but it is more respectful of human diversity. It allows the ancient world to be many things at once. It allows people before history to be intelligent without making them identical. It allows mystery without flattening difference. False certainty often comes from impatience with this complexity. We want one answer, because one answer feels powerful. But the human past may not have one hidden key. It may have many small keys, most of them broken, some of them still buried, some of them lost forever. A carved stone may open one question. A burial may open another. A submerged valley may open another. A long-distance shell or pigment may open another. None of them alone gives us the whole human past. Together, they create a pattern of possibility and restraint. They tell us that early people were capable of more than old stereotypes allowed, but they also remind us that capability is not the same as proof of every imagined achievement. A person can be brilliant without writing. A group can be organized without being a state. A place can be sacred without being a city. A network can be wide without being an empire. These distinctions matter because they keep the central question from becoming dishonest. Did a lost human civilization exist before history? We cannot answer by collecting every mystery and stacking it into a conclusion. We have to ask what kind of civilization we mean, what kind of evidence would be needed, what has actually been found, and what remains uncertain. The absence of writing makes this harder. The decay of organic materials makes it harder. Drowned landscapes make it harder. But difficulty is not proof. Difficulty is only the condition under which careful thought must work. That is why the temptation of myths is so strong, and why it must be treated gently but firmly. Myths may preserve memory, but they also transform it. Over generations, a real event can become moral teaching, sacred story, identity, warning, poetry, or symbol. A flood may become judgment, a migration may become origin, a lost place may become a dream of return. The transformation does not make the story worthless. It makes it human. But once it becomes human in that way, we cannot read it as if it were a modern field report. We have to listen for meaning without pretending we have recovered every fact. This is the discipline that protects wonder. It does not close the door. It keeps the door from becoming a mirror, reflecting only what we already wanted to see. Before history, people certainly lived, remembered, gathered, suffered, adapted, and created meaning in ways we will never fully recover. Some of their worlds were lost. Some may have been more complex than we once assumed. But if we want to honor them, we should not cover their silence with our loudest guesses. We should let the fragments remain fragments when that is what they are, and let them be moving because they are real, not because we have made them larger than truth allows. The safest way to move through this subject is not to remove mystery, but to separate different kinds of mystery. There is the mystery that comes from evidence we do not yet understand. There is the mystery that comes from evidence that no longer survives. There is the mystery that comes from human stories changing shape across generations. And there is the mystery we create ourselves when we want the past to be more dramatic than it needs to be. These are not the same. A careful listener can feel the difference. An old site whose purpose is still debated is not the same as proof of a hidden civilization. A drowned landscape is not the same as a drowned empire. A myth about a lost place is not the same as a map. A similarity between symbols is not the same as contact. A gap in the record is not the same as a secret. When we keep these differences clear, the question becomes more honest and also more useful. It allows us to wonder without losing our footing. It allows us to say that human beings before written history were capable of complex thought, meaningful gathering, skilled building, long memory, and wide connection, while also saying that we do not have evidence for every claim people sometimes attach to them. This distinction is especially important because the phrase lost civilization can easily pull many unrelated ideas into one shape. It can make people imagine a single vanished source behind many ancient cultures, as if the achievements of later peoples must have come from somewhere else, somewhere hidden, somewhere more mysterious. But that can quietly take credit away from the real communities who built, learned, adapted, and created in their own places. Ancient people do not become more impressive when we replace their local histories with one grand invisible explanation. They become more impressive when we let them be specific. A group living near a changing coast had its own knowledge. A group gathering at a ceremonial site had its own reasons. A group shaping stone in a particular valley had its own techniques. A group painting, carving, burying, exchanging, or traveling had its own inherited world. Some of those worlds touched one another. Some may have influenced one another. Some may have disappeared almost completely. But we do not honor them by flattening them into a single secret civilization, unless the evidence truly leads there. The better question is more patient. What kinds of complexity can we actually see? What kinds can we reasonably infer? What kinds must remain unknown? We can see tools, hearths, burials, pigments, monuments, settlement traces, animal remains, plant remains, and the movement of materials. We can infer skill, planning, cooperation, repeated use of places, care for the dead in some contexts, adaptation to landscapes, and sometimes long-distance connection. But we must be careful when moving from these signs to larger claims. A monument can show cooperation, but not automatically kingship. A burial can show care or ritual behavior, but not automatically a full religion we can describe. A traded object can show contact, but not automatically a state or empire. A myth can show memory and meaning, but not automatically a historical report. These limits may feel restrictive, yet they are what keep the story from becoming false. They protect the listener from being led into certainty where certainty does not exist. They also protect the dignity of the past itself. The people before history were not waiting for modern imagination to complete them. They lived complete lives in their own present. They felt hunger, warmth, cold, grief, relief, fear, affection, patience, boredom, wonder, and belonging. They taught children, watched seasons, made tools, returned to places, remembered the dead, followed animals, gathered plants, and looked at the sky without knowing that one day we would call them prehistoric. Their world was not a puzzle made for us. It was their home. That thought should make us gentle with the evidence. If a place is unexplained, we do not have to force it to speak. If a story is old, we do not have to turn it into proof. If a shoreline is drowned, we do not have to place a city beneath it. The true loss is already large enough. Before writing, countless names disappeared. Countless songs disappeared. Countless meanings attached to stones, rivers, hills, coasts, fires, and graves disappeared. Entire systems of relationship may have ended without leaving an official trace. That is not a small mystery. It is perhaps more profound than the dramatic version, because it is not about one hidden answer. It is about the ordinary fact that human life is mostly perishable. The things that carry meaning most deeply are often the things that time removes first. Voice, touch, instruction, memory, rhythm, trust, grief, and return. So by the end of this part of the journey, we do not need to choose between wonder and honesty. We need both. Wonder without honesty becomes fantasy. Honesty without wonder becomes too narrow to feel the size of what has been lost. The question of a lost human civilization before history should remain open but not empty. Open to the possibility that human complexity was older and more varied than the old simple picture, closed to claims that outrun the evidence. Open to drowned coasts, lost networks, vanished gathering places, and oral worlds that left only fragments. Closed to the easy certainty of secret empires without proof. In that balance, the past becomes quiet again, but not dull. It becomes a place where we can listen carefully, knowing that some answers may never return, and that the absence of an answer is not a failure. Sometimes it is the most truthful thing the deep past can give us. By this point, the question has become more careful than it first appeared. Did a lost human civilization exist before history? We cannot answer it honestly by saying yes in the dramatic sense, as if we had already found proof of a forgotten empire, a vanished world power, or a civilization with knowledge far beyond the evidence. That would be too much. It would turn an open question into a claim the surviving record does not support. But we also cannot answer by saying no in a way that makes the deep past seem empty, simple, or unworthy of attention. That would be too little. It would ignore how much human life can disappear when it is carried in memory, built from perishable materials, scattered across changing landscapes, or submerged beneath rising seas. So the truthful answer begins with a boundary. We can say some things with confidence. We can say that human beings before written history were not waiting passively for civilization to begin. They already had language, memory, skill, teaching, social bonds, symbolic behavior, and the ability to adapt to difficult environments. They made tools with care. They used fire. They learned landscapes. They moved materials. They buried some of their dead in ways that suggest attention and meaning. They created images and marks in some places. They gathered at certain locations repeatedly. They crossed distances and survived changes in climate that would have tested any human community. These are not small things. They are the foundations of human life. But we must also say what we cannot say. We cannot claim that a specific lost civilization existed before history unless there is evidence strong enough to support that claim. We cannot add kings where no kings are known. We cannot add writing where no writing survives. We cannot add cities where the evidence shows gathering places, camps, or monuments, but not urban life. We cannot take a drowned landscape and fill it with buildings simply because water makes the imagination move. We cannot take myth and force it to become literal history whenever it feels old or beautiful. This is the line that protects the video from becoming dishonest. It is not a line against wonder, it is a line against certainty that has not been earned. The deep past gives us fragments, and the fragments deserve to be read with patience. A stone tool can tell us about skill, but not the whole society. A carved pillar can tell us about labour, symbol and gathering, but not every belief of the people who raised it. A shell far from the sea can tell us about movement or exchange, but not the full route by which it travelled. A submerged plain can tell us that people may have lost habitable land, but not automatically that an advanced city sleeps below the waves. A legend can tell us what people remembered, feared, valued or explained, but not always what happened in the exact form the story gives. These limits may seem slow, but slowness is useful here. It allows the listener to trust the journey. It reminds us that being careful does not weaken the subject. It deepens it. Because the real story is not that we already know of a hidden civilization and are revealing it. The real story is that the human past is larger than what history can write down, and larger than what archaeology can easily preserve. Somewhere between proof and silence lies a wide human territory, complex enough to matter, fragile enough to vanish, and difficult enough that we must approach it with humility. If we ask what can be said, we can say that civilization did not appear suddenly out of nothing. It grew from older capacities, memory, cooperation, exchange, ritual, teaching, return, and shared attention to place. If we ask what cannot be said, we must admit that those older capacities do not automatically prove the existence of a lost prehistoric state. The truth is not as simple as a yes or a no. It is more like a careful unfolding. The deeper we look, the more we see that before history there were human worlds with order, meaning, and intelligence. But the names, borders, stories, and full shapes of many of those worlds are gone. And where they are gone, honesty asks us not to replace them with whatever story would make the mystery easier to sell. A useful way to stay honest with this question is to think in layers, not in extremes. The extreme answer says either, yes, there must have been a great lost civilization before history, hidden from us by time, or no, there was nothing worth calling complex before cities and writing. Both answers are too simple. The evidence asks for a layered answer. At one layer, we can see basic survival: food, shelter, fire, tools, movement, and adaptation. At another layer, we can see learning, techniques passed from older hands to younger hands, knowledge of stone, bone, wood, plants, animals, weather, and seasons. And at another layer, we can see social life, sharing, obligation, care, cooperation, conflict, kinship, and the need to keep a group together through hardship. At another layer, we can see symbolic behavior, pigments, images, burials, ornaments, repeated places, and signs that human beings were not living only in the immediate present, but in a world of meaning. At another layer, we can see wider connection, materials moving across distance, groups meeting, ideas spreading, routes remembered, and landscapes shared by more than one community. None of these layers alone equals a city. None of them automatically equals a state, but together they show that the road towards civilization was long, uneven, and deeply human before it became visible as written history. This is important because the word civilization often makes us look for a finished form. We look for the end of the process, the city, the wall, the granary, the ruler, the scribe, the law. But before every finished form, there are earlier habits that make it possible. Before a city can organize thousands of people, smaller groups must already know how to cooperate. Before a law can be written, people must already understand expectation, fairness, punishment, and repair. Before a temple can be built, people must already know how a place becomes meaningful. Before a road can be marked, people must already know how to return along a path. Before an archive can preserve memory, human beings must already know what is worth remembering. In this sense, the deepest roots of civilization are not made of brick. They are made of repeated human behavior. They are made of the ability to hold a world together across time. This does not mean the roots are the same as the tree. We should not call every root a civilization. A mobile hunting group is not the same thing as an urban state. A ceremonial gathering place is not the same thing as a capital city. A network of exchange is not the same thing as an empire. A remembered tradition is not the same thing as a written archive. These differences matter, but if we separate them too sharply, we lose the continuity of the human story. Later civilization did not arrive as a stranger. It grew from capacities that had been forming for a very long time. And some of those capacities may have created worlds that were rich enough, organized enough, and enduring enough to be lost in meaningful ways, even if they never became civilizations in the textbook sense. Perhaps this is the most truthful middle ground. We should not ask the deep past to give us a hidden version of Mesopotamia before Mesopotamia. We should not demand a prehistoric Egypt beneath the sea or a forgotten empire behind every ancient monument. But we can ask whether there were complex human arrangements before writing that do not fit neatly into our modern categories. We can ask whether some societies gathered seasonally in large numbers, exchanged materials across distance, preserved stories over many generations, shaped places with symbolic meaning, and maintained social rules that are now almost impossible to reconstruct. We can ask whether some of these arrangements were lost so completely that only fragments remain. These are honest questions because they do not decide more than the evidence allows. They open space for inquiry, without turning inquiry into certainty. They also help us understand why old stereotypes about prehistoric people can be so misleading. If we imagine them only as people struggling moment by moment to survive, then we miss the patience, planning, memory, and social depth that survival itself required. To live well before writing was not to live without intelligence. It was to live with a different kind of record, a record held in bodies, landscapes, tools, movements, and voices. That record could be very strong while people kept it alive, and very fragile once the chain was broken. So the phrase, lost civilization, may be too heavy for some of what we are describing, but the phrase nothing was lost is far too light. Something was lost. Many things were lost. Not always cities, not always monuments, not always states, but ways of knowing, ways of gathering, ways of remembering, ways of belonging to land and to one another. The evidence lets us glimpse these layers, not fully restore them, and perhaps that is why the question remains useful. It teaches us not to measure human worth only by what became permanent. It teaches us that the long, unwritten past was not a blank space before civilization, but a deep field of human possibility, where some things grew into history and many others disappeared before anyone could give them a written name. Perhaps the most honest answer we can give is that the past contains both more and less than people often imagine. More complexity, but less certainty. More intelligence, but fewer records. More connection, but fewer names. More human worlds, but fewer ways to reconstruct them completely. This balance can feel uncomfortable because the mind prefers a clearer conclusion. We would like to know exactly what existed, where it existed, how large it was, what people called themselves, what they believed, how they organized power, and how their story ended. Written history sometimes allows us to approach those questions. Prehistory often does not. It leaves us in a different position. We can see signs of human capability, but we cannot always connect those signs into a complete narrative. We can see evidence of planning, but not always the plan. We can see the remains of gathering places, but not hear the conversations that happened there. We can see traces of exchange, but not recover every relationship behind them. We can see a burial, but not fully enter the thoughts of the people who stood beside it. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is simply the reality of studying a world that mostly existed before writing. And once we accept that reality, the title of this video begins to look different. Did a lost human civilization exist before history? The answer may depend on what we expect the word civilization to do. If we use it only for large urban societies with writing, then there is no clear evidence for a forgotten prehistoric civilization of that kind, hidden just beyond the edge of accepted history. The evidence does not require such a conclusion. But if we use the question to ask whether there were organized human worlds whose full structure has been lost because they left little written or durable evidence, then the answer becomes more open. In that sense, the past may indeed contain lost worlds, worlds of memory, worlds of seasonal gathering, worlds of exchange, worlds attached to coastlines that no longer exist, worlds whose most important institutions were not buildings, but relationships. Worlds whose archives were people rather than libraries. The difficulty is that these worlds resist the categories that later history prefers. They do not always have capitals. They do not always have borders. They do not always leave monuments. Their complexity may have been distributed across land, movement, ritual, and memory. When such a world disappears, the loss does not necessarily look dramatic. It may leave only scattered evidence, fragments that seem unrelated until we place them beside one another. A burial here, a gathering place there, a distant material somewhere else, a drowned landscape beyond the modern coast, a route remembered for generations and then forgotten. None of these fragments alone tells the whole story. Together they suggest that human life before history may have been richer than the surviving record can fully show. But they also remind us that richness is not the same as proof of a hidden empire. This distinction has followed us throughout the journey. Every time we approached a mystery, we tried to ask two questions instead of one. What does the evidence allow us to see? And what does it not allow us to claim? That habit may seem cautious, but it is actually a form of respect. It respects the people of the past by refusing to use them as characters in a story we invented for our own satisfaction. It respects the listener by separating evidence from speculation, and it respects the question itself by leaving room for future discoveries without pretending we already know what those discoveries will be. Somewhere beneath forests, fields, deserts, river sediments, modern cities, and coastal waters, there are undoubtedly traces we have not found. Some may change details of what we know. Some may reveal gathering places, settlements, routes, or connections that surprise us. Some may confirm ideas that are currently uncertain. Others may overturn assumptions. That possibility is one of the reasons archaeology remains so compelling. But future discoveries will still need evidence. They will not arrive because we wanted a mystery to be true. They will arrive because patient work uncovers something real. And that is why the question remains alive. As one, not because it has been answered, but because it has not. The deep past still holds unknowns. Yet the unknowns are bounded by reality. They belong to real human beings who lived, learned, cooperated, struggled, adapted, remembered, and eventually disappeared. Their world was not empty. It was not waiting for civilization. It was already human. Perhaps that is the most important realization before we move forward. The unwritten past does not need to become a legend in order to matter. It matters because it was lived. It matters because it shaped everything that came after. And it matters because so much of it was lost not through mystery, but through the ordinary passage of time. By now, the question is no longer asking us to search for a hidden kingdom. It is asking us to reconsider what counts as a civilization, what counts as evidence, and what kinds of human worlds can disappear before history has the chance to remember them. Maybe the mistake is that we keep imagining the lost civilization as one place, one hidden center, one forgotten city, one buried capital with a name we have not yet recovered. That image is powerful because it gives the mind something to search for. It turns the question into a map with a missing mark. Somewhere, we imagine, there must be a place where the answer waits in stone, but the deeper human past may not have been organized in a way that gives us such a simple target. Before written history, before states, before permanent cities became the most visible form of human complexity, the things that held people together may have been spread out across many places. A group's world might include seasonal camps, hunting grounds, gathering sites, water sources, burial places, stone sources, coastal routes, mountain passes, meeting zones, and remembered landmarks. No single one of these places would look like a civilization by itself. Yet together, in the minds and movements of the people who knew them, they could form a complete world. This is why the question may need to shift again. Perhaps what was lost was not one civilization, but a pattern of connection between people, land, memory, and return. A pattern too flexible to become a city, too oral to become a written history, and too scattered to leave one grand ruin behind. If we look only for a central capital, we may miss the wider network. We may see fragments and think they are unrelated, because we no longer have the living map that once connected them. A shell far inland, a stone tool far from its source, a repeated gathering place, a burial with care, a cave with pigment, a submerged coastal plain, a path along a river valley. Each piece may seem modest, but in the lived world, pieces like these may have belonged to relationships that stretched across time and distance. This does not mean all prehistoric people were connected into one enormous system. It does not mean there was a single global culture behind later civilizations. That would be too much, and it would flatten the diversity of the human past. The more careful idea is that many local and regional worlds may have existed, each with its own memory, roots, meeting places, and ways of making meaning. Some may have lasted for a few generations. Some may have lasted much longer. Some may have touched neighboring worlds through exchange, marriage, migration, ritual, conflict, or shared landscapes. Some may have vanished so completely that only faint traces remain. In this sense, the lost civilization before history may be plural, not singular. It may not be one lost world, but many lost worlds. And that thought is quieter than the usual fantasy, but far more human. It allows us to imagine prehistoric life not as a single ladder climbing towards civilization, but as many streams moving through different landscapes. Some streams eventually joined the rivers that became the great ancient civilizations we know from written records. Others ended, changed course, dried out, or flowed beneath later history without leaving names. Their disappearance was not necessarily a dramatic collapse. It may have been the slow fading of a route, the loss of a language, the merging of one group with another, the drowning of a coast, the abandonment of a gathering place, the death of a remembered story. When we think this way, the word lost becomes less theatrical and more exact. Lost does not always mean destroyed in a single event. Lost can mean no longer connected to memory. Lost can mean no longer readable. Lost can mean the people who knew the pattern are gone, while only the scattered points remain. A constellation is a useful image here, as long as we use it gently. The stars are real, but the pattern between them depends on a mind that knows how to join them. Archaeology may find the stars, objects, sites, bones, stones, sediments, marks, but the pattern, the living meaning between them, is often what time removes. A prehistoric world may have been like that. Not invisible to its own people, but difficult for us to see because we have the points without the old lines. This is why a single yes or no still feels unsatisfying. If someone asks whether there was a lost urban civilization before history, we should answer with caution and say that such a claim needs evidence we do not have. But if someone asks whether human worlds existed before history whose complexity is now mostly lost, the answer is almost certainly yes in a broader, humbler sense. Not one hidden empire, not one secret source of all later culture, but many arrangements of life that were meaningful, organized, and fragile. Many human worlds that existed fully in their own time, then passed away before anyone could write them into history. And perhaps that is the question we have been approaching all along. Not where is the lost civilization, but how many forms of human order have disappeared because we were taught to look for only one kind. If the lost worlds before history were many rather than one, then we also have to think about how they touched one another. A human world does not need to be isolated simply because it is prehistoric. People move, people meet, people exchange, people marry across groups, people learn from strangers, people avoid enemies, people copy useful techniques. People carry stories farther than their own feet have traveled. Over time, these movements can create a web that is wider than any single community, even without roads, writing, or formal borders. This web would not look like an empire on a map. It would not have a capital. It would not send officials to distant provinces. It would not leave behind a single archive that says, "These people belong together." Yet it could still connect lives across distance. One group might know another because they meet at a certain river when animals pass. Another might know a coastal people because shells or fish products travel inland through exchanges. Another might know a mountain route because stone from that region has been valued for generations. Another might share a ritual pattern, a story, a tool shape, or a way of making ornaments that slowly spreads through repeated contact. Such connections are difficult to reconstruct because they may have been loose, seasonal, and personal rather than centralized, but they matter deeply to the question of a lost human civilization before history, because they show how human complexity can exist between the scale of the small camp and the later city-state. We often imagine civilization as a single center controlling many parts. But some older human worlds may have been connected without being controlled. They may have shared knowledge without having one authority. They may have influenced one another without becoming one people. They may have formed patterns that were real in practice, but not formal in the way later history teaches us to expect. This is why the phrase Lost civilization can mislead us if we make it too rigid. A civilization sounds like a thing with edges, but prehistoric connection may have been more like weather, more like a tide, more like a network of paths that changed with season, climate, need, and memory. A person could belong to one family, one traveling group, one language community, one wider exchange network, and one seasonal gathering world all at once. These layers of belonging may not have been written anywhere, but they could guide behavior with real strength. They could tell people whom to trust, where to go, what to bring, whom to avoid, where a story should be repeated, and which places were not ordinary ground. When such a network disappears, the loss is hard to name because there may never have been one name for it. Later, archaeologists might find distant materials, similar styles, repeated practices, or traces of shared movement. But the lived relationship behind those clues may remain uncertain. We may see connection, but not always understand its emotional or social depth. Was an object traded as a useful tool, offered as a gift, carried by a married person into a new group, brought to a gathering, taken from a distant place with ritual meaning, or copied because someone admired its form? Sometimes evidence cannot choose among these possibilities. That does not make the connection meaningless. It simply reminds us that human life is richer than the objects that survive it. The same is true of ideas. An idea can move without leaving a clear trail. A way of treating the dead, a pattern of marking stone, a method of shaping a point, a rhythm of seasonal gathering, or a story about a landscape may pass from one group to another and become local in each place it arrives. After many generations, the origin may be forgotten. The practice remains, changed by each community that carries it. This is another way a lost world can disappear, not by being destroyed, but by being absorbed. A group may merge with another, a language may shift, a ritual may be transformed, a route may be used by new people, a memory may survive in altered form, no longer attached to its original place. In later history, we sometimes have documents that help us trace such changes. Before writing, many of those transformations happened without leaving a witness who could explain them. This does not mean we should imagine a single hidden source behind every resemblance. It means the opposite. We should be open to many small movements, many local inventions, many contacts, many separations, and many forgotten borrowings. The deep past may have been less like a dark, empty room and more like a wide night landscape where small fires appeared at different distances, sometimes alone, sometimes visible to one another, sometimes sharing warmth, sometimes going out. A lost civilization, in this gentler sense, may have been a pattern of lights rather than one great city of flame. Some lights became the beginnings of later villages, towns, and written societies. Others left no direct descendant that we can name. Others may have contributed something small to a future world, and then disappeared as separate identities. And because these older networks were held together by memory, movement, trust, and repeated contact, they were vulnerable in ways that stone cities were not. If the climate changed, a route could fail. If animals moved, a meeting season could end. If the sea covered a coast, a chain of exchange could break. If conflict scattered people, stories could fragment. If a disease, famine, or long hardship reduced a group, a whole body of knowledge could disappear. No monument would need to fall. No empire would need to collapse. The network would simply loosen, and later, when we found its traces, we might not even know they had once belonged together. This is why the title's question keeps becoming wider. It is not only asking whether there was one missing civilization before history, it is asking whether our idea of civilization is too dependent on visible centers. It asks whether human order can exist as a web, whether memory can hold together what writing later fixes, whether movement can connect people as powerfully as walls, and whether many small worlds can vanish without leaving the kind of ruin we know how to recognize. The honest answer is still careful. We cannot name what has left no name. We cannot describe a network in detail when only fragments remain. But we can say that the human past was full of relationships, and relationships are among the easiest things for time to erase. What remains may be the object that moved. What is lost is the hand that gave it, the voice that explained it, the trust that allowed it to pass, and the memory that knew where it belonged. If we stop looking for one lost center, another possibility becomes easier to see. The lost civilization before history may not have been a civilization in the singular at all. It may have been a long human condition. Many communities, many remembered places, many roots, many ways of belonging, all existing before the written record became strong enough to preserve names. This idea does not give us the sharp answer that imagination often wants. It does not lead us to one buried city or one secret origin. But it may bring us closer to the truth of how most human beings actually lived. For tens of thousands of years, people did not live inside the boundaries of states. They lived inside landscapes. Their world was made of river bends, ridges, coasts, caves, trees, animal paths, open plains, shelters, fires, and other people whose movements might be known only at certain times of year. A group's order may have been spread through all of these things. The land was not separate from society. It helped organize memory. It told people where to go, when to wait, what to gather, what to avoid, and where they belonged. When such a world disappeared, it did not leave one empty throne. It left broken connections. A place lost its visitors, a story lost its setting, a route lost its walkers, a practice lost its teachers. A name was no longer spoken beside the thing it named. This is a different kind of loss from the fall of a city, but it is still profound. Later history often remembers collapse through events: a conquest, a fire, a famine, a king's death, a ruined wall, an abandoned palace. Before history, loss may have happened without a record of the moment. It may have happened through gradual changes so ordinary that no one could see the full ending while living inside it. A gathering that happened every few years stopped happening. A coast moved farther away. A river changed its course. A group joined another group and slowly changed its speech. Children learned a shorter version of an old story, then their children learned only a fragment. A tool-making technique was replaced by another. A burial place became unknown. A landmark disappeared into forest, water, sand, or later settlement. Nothing in that process would need to look like a dramatic collapse, yet a world could still be ending. And because no one wrote the ending down, we are left with a strange kind of absence. Not the absence of people, but the absence of their own explanation. This may be the most honest way to hold the title in the mind. Did a lost human civilization exist before history? Perhaps the better answer is that many human worlds existed before history, and many were lost in ways that do not match the stories we usually tell about civilizations. Some may have been quite simple in material terms and still rich in memory. Some may have been widely connected without being centralized. Some may have built meaningful places without becoming cities. Some may have lived along coasts that are now underwater. Some may have been absorbed into later ways of life so thoroughly that their separate identity can no longer be seen. To call all of them civilizations would stretch the word too far. To call none of them important would make the opposite mistake. The careful middle is to recognize that civilization, as a human capacity, has older roots than civilization as an archaeological category. The capacity to share meaning, organize work, remember places, connect groups, teach children, honor the dead, and carry knowledge across generations did not begin when writing began. Writing made some of these things more durable. Cities made some of them more visible. States made some of them more formal. But the human groundwork was older, and much of that groundwork is lost because it was never meant to survive as evidence for us. It survived as long as people carried it. It lived in voices, habits, paths, gestures, obligations, and repeated returns. Once those carriers were gone, the system could disappear without leaving more than traces. This does not make the deep past unknowable in every way. It makes it partial. We can know enough to reject the old image of empty prehistory. We can know enough to reject careless fantasies. We can know enough to see that the road towards civilization was not one road, but many experiments in living together. Some experiments became visible foundations for later history. Others ended without descendants we can name. Others may still be hidden in small clues that have not yet been studied or understood. The important thing is not to force them into one answer. The important thing is to let the question become more mature. A lost civilization before history may be less like a lost island and more like a lost forest. You may find a few seeds, a few roots, a dark layer in the soil, the shape of an old trunk, and from these you understand that something once grew there. But you cannot stand beneath its full shade again. You cannot hear all the birds that lived in it. You cannot know every path through it. The loss is real, even when it cannot be completely restored, and perhaps that is where this part of the journey leaves us. Not with one hidden kingdom, but with a wider respect for vanished human worlds, not with certainty, but with a clearer kind of wonder. Before history, people were not waiting to become human. They were already human, already making order, already carrying memory, already shaping places into meaning. Some of what they made became the beginning of what we call civilization. Much of what they made disappeared before anyone could write it down, and the silence left behind is not proof of emptiness. It is the quiet border of everything we can no longer ask them to explain. By the time we reach the end of this question, it is clear that the most useful answer is not the easiest one. Did a lost human civilization exist before history? If we demand a simple yes, we may step beyond the evidence and turn the deep past into a story shaped more by desire than by truth. If we demand a simple no, we may close our eyes to the enormous amount of human life that existed before writing, and to the many ways time can erase what people once knew, built, remembered, and loved. So the educational value of this question is not that it gives us a dramatic conclusion. Its value is that it teaches us how to think with humility. Humility does not mean thinking less of early humans. It means thinking more carefully about them. It means refusing to imagine them as crude, empty figures simply because they did not leave books behind. It also means refusing to decorate them with unsupported inventions simply because we want the past to feel more exciting. Between those two errors there is a quieter respect. The people before history were not primitive versions of us waiting for civilization to begin. They were human beings living in complete worlds of their own present. They woke to weather, hunger, memory, responsibility, danger, affection, fatigue, and the slow rhythm of seasons. They learned from older people. They taught younger people. They returned to certain places. They carried tools, stories, names, fears, hopes, and obligations. They watched landscapes change in ways that could be generous or frightening. They knew things that we no longer know, not because their knowledge was magical, but because it belonged to worlds that no longer exist. A person who could read animal tracks across hard ground, find water in a dry season, prepare a hide, remember a long route, recognize useful stone, tell a story correctly, or understand when a group should move was carrying real intelligence. Much of that intelligence did not need writing to work, but without writing, it could vanish almost completely when the chain of teaching broke. This is one of the central lessons of the whole journey. Civilization is not only a structure outside the human mind, it is also the fragile continuity between one generation and the next. Later civilizations made that continuity more visible through cities, laws, monuments, archives, and written records. Earlier human worlds often held continuity in voice, practice, memory, place, and return. Those forms were powerful while they lived, but vulnerable after they ended. To understand that is to become more careful with the word lost. Lost does not always mean destroyed by disaster. Lost can mean unrecorded. Lost can mean absorbed into later people. Lost can mean spoken for 1,000 years and then spoken no more. Lost can mean covered by water, consumed by forest, scattered by erosion, or made invisible beneath later settlements. Lost can mean that the objects remain, but the meaning between them is gone. And when we think about the past in this way, we begin to see why archaeology is both extraordinary and incomplete. It gives us tools, bones, pigments, hearths, monuments, burials, settlement traces, and environmental clues. It gives us evidence strong enough to correct old stereotypes and widen our sense of what early humans could do. But it rarely gives back the full living world. It cannot return every voice around the fire. It cannot restore every song, every name, every private grief, every remembered path, every rule taught by example, every meaning attached to a hill or shore. That absence should not frustrate us into fantasy. It should teach us patience. The deep past asks to be approached not as a stage for dramatic claims, but as a real human distance. We can move toward it, but we cannot possess it completely. We can learn from the traces, but we cannot force the traces to answer questions they were never built to answer. This is why the final part of the video should not feel like a verdict handed down too firmly. It should feel like a widening of attention. The question began by asking whether there was a lost civilization before history. It now asks us to notice how much of human civilization may have always depended on things that do not survive well. Trust, memory, teaching, movement, cooperation, ritual, and the slow making of meaning between people. These things are not less important because they are hard to excavate. In many ways, they are the very things that made later civilization possible. Before people wrote laws, they practiced obligation. Before people built archives, they remembered. Before people made capitals, they gathered. Before people drew maps, they knew routes. Before people carved names into stone, they spoke names into the air and trusted another human being to remember them. And perhaps that is the first educational message hidden inside the question. We should not measure the worth of the past only by what became permanent. We should also honor the fragile human systems that carried life forward before permanence was possible. There is another lesson here, one that reaches beyond archaeology and into the way we think about ourselves. We often trust what can be counted, stored, named, dated, and displayed. We trust the wall that still stands more than the path that has disappeared. We trust the tablet more than the remembered voice. We trust the monument more than the daily habit that made a group strong enough to raise it. This is understandable, because evidence matters. Without evidence, we cannot tell the difference between careful history and invented story. But evidence is not the same as value. The things that survive are not always the things that mattered most to the people who lived. A stone tool may survive longer than the hand that taught its making. A grave good may survive longer than the grief that placed it there. A carved pillar may survive longer than the gathering that gave it meaning. A coastline may vanish while the people who once knew it carry its memory for a while, then lose that memory too. When we ask whether a lost human civilization existed before history, we are also asking whether our own idea of importance has been shaped too strongly by survival. We look at what remains and call it the past, but it is only the surviving edge of the past. Behind it were voices, gestures, relationships, obligations, fear, kindness, hunger, waiting, teaching, and return. These are difficult to preserve, but they are not small. In fact, they may be the deep substance of human life. The people before history were not meaningful only when they built something large enough for us to admire. They were meaningful when they learned how to keep children alive through winter, when they shared food after risk, when they remembered where water could still be found, when they sat beside someone who was sick, when they carried knowledge across years, when they treated a place as worth returning to, when they held a story steady long enough for another generation to inherit it. This is not sentimental. It is realistic. Human civilization, even in its later written form, rests on ordinary continuity. Cities depend on people trusting one another enough to cooperate. Laws depend on older ideas of obligation. Archives depend on the belief that memory should be preserved. Temples depend on shared meaning. Roads depend on the older act of knowing where to go. Writing depends on language, and language depends on minds shaped by social life long before the first written signs. So if we ask where civilization began, the answer cannot be only in the first city or the first tablet. Those moments are important, but they stand on older ground. The ground was prepared by countless generations who learned how to hold knowledge together without permanent records. Most of their names are gone. Most of their places are damaged, hidden, or changed. Most of their meanings cannot be fully reconstructed. Yet their contribution remains, not as a single lost empire, but as the human foundation beneath later history. This is why the most responsible answer to the title is not a confident announcement, but a careful distinction. No, we do not have reliable evidence for a single advanced lost civilization before history in the dramatic popular sense. Yes, we do have reason to believe that many complex human worlds existed before writing, and many of their details, connections, places, and meanings have been lost. End quote. That answer may be less sensational, but it is more useful. It lets us keep our curiosity without losing honesty. It lets us respect the unknown without turning it into a product. It lets us see prehistoric people as fully human without pretending we can recover everything they knew. And it gives the listener something valuable to carry away, the ability to live with an open question without forcing it into a false conclusion. In a world where dramatic claims often move faster than careful evidence, that ability matters. It teaches patience. It teaches discernment. It teaches us to ask what supports a claim, what remains uncertain, and what kind of humility the subject deserves. The lost human past is not empty because we cannot name it all. It is not ours to fill with whatever we wish. It is a quiet inheritance that asks for attention. Perhaps this is the true educational value of the question. It reminds us that knowledge is not only about possessing answers. Sometimes knowledge begins by knowing where certainty ends. It begins by standing before a fragment and saying, "This is real, this matters, but it is not the whole world." It begins by admitting that the people who came before us were both knowable and unreachable, visible and hidden, ordinary and astonishing. And if we can learn to hold that balance with the earliest human past, perhaps we can hold it elsewhere too. We can become less hungry for dramatic certainty and more capable of careful wonder. We can honor what evidence shows and still feel the depth of what evidence cannot bring back. That may be a quieter ending than the promise of a secret civilization, but it is a more honest one, and perhaps a more lasting one. So in the end, the question remains open, but it is no longer vague. Did a lost human civilization exist before history? If by that we mean a hidden empire with cities, writing, rulers, and powers that the evidence does not show, then honesty asks us to be careful, and say that we do not have proof of such a thing. But if by lost we mean human worlds that once held memory, skill, belief, connection, and order, then the answer becomes much deeper. Yes, many human worlds were lost before history could name them. Some were lost because they were made from materials that decayed. Some were lost because people moved and never returned. Some were lost because coastlines shifted and the sea covered old ground. Some were lost because stories changed, languages disappeared, rituals ended, and the last people who understood certain places were no longer there to explain them. Some may have been small. Some may have been connected across wide distances. Some may have gathered around seasonal places, stones, rivers, caves, animals, ancestors, or memories we can no longer enter. We may never know their names. We may never know whether they thought of themselves as one people or many. We may never know which places were ordinary and which were sacred, which stories were warnings and which were histories, which paths were practical and which were filled with old meaning. But we can know this. The unwritten past was not empty. It was lived fully and seriously by people whose minds were not waiting for history to make them human. They already belonged to families, landscapes, memories, duties, fears, hopes, and shared ways of life. They already had to make sense of time, weather, hunger, sickness, death, childhood, aging, distance, and change. They already had to ask in their own ways how to survive, how to remember, how to teach, how to return, and how to let one generation inherit something from the one before. That is why the idea of a lost civilization before history becomes less like a secret to be exposed and more like a lesson in attention. It teaches us that not all important things announce themselves with monuments. Not all intelligence leaves a text. Not all order becomes a state. Not all memory becomes an archive. Some of the deepest human structures are quiet. They live in repetition. They live in trust. They live in the way a child learns, by walking behind an older person. They live in the way a group returns to a place, because the place has become part of who they are. They live in the way a story is told again, not for entertainment alone, but because it holds a warning, a root, a name, a grief, or a reason to belong. And because these structures are quiet, they are easy for time to take away. The earth may preserve a blade, but not the lesson. It may preserve a bone, but not the mourning. It may preserve a stone circle, but not the words spoken there. It may preserve a shell far from the sea, but not the trust that carried it from hand to hand. This should not make us feel that the past is hopelessly distant. It should make us gentler when we approach it. Every fragment is both small and large. Small because it cannot give us the whole world. Large because it proves that the whole world was once there. A hearth is not only ash, it is the edge of warmth. A tool is not only stone, it is the edge of knowledge. A burial is not only a body, it is the edge of care. A drowned plane is not only geology, it is the edge of a possible home. If this video leaves one useful thought behind, let it be this: curiosity is strongest when it is joined with humility. We do not need to choose between wonder and truth. We can wonder about the lost human past while refusing to invent what we cannot know. We can respect prehistoric people without turning them into myths. We can admit that many things disappeared without claiming that every disappearance hides a grand secret. The past does not become less meaningful when we remove exaggeration. It becomes more human. It becomes a long, quiet field of lives that came before us. Lives that made our own possible. Lives that left enough traces to remind us of them, and too few traces for us to fully possess them. Maybe that is the final reason this question stays with us. It is not only about whether a lost civilization existed before history. It is about whether we can accept that much of what makes a civilization human is also what makes it fragile. Memory can fade. Voices can end. Places can change. Names can vanish. And still, something real was there. So perhaps the deepest question is not whether a single lost civilization waits somewhere beneath the earth or the sea. Perhaps the deeper question is this: if so much of the human past was carried in living memory, and living memory can disappear, how many worlds have we already lost without ever knowing what to call them?